Clara Whitmore's hands were still bleeding when Harvey Dalton laughed. She had dropped the glass. She had cut her palm on the broken pieces. And while red spread across the wooden floor of the Silver Moon Saloon, the richest man in Red Hollow threw back his head and laughed like it was the funniest thing he had ever seen in his life. "Clean it up, saloon girl," he said. "That's all you're good for." Every man in that room laughed with him. Every single one. If you've ever been told you were worth nothing, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and watch this story all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Clara Whitmore did not cry. That was the first thing people noticed about her, and somehow it made them angrier than anything else she could have done. A woman who cried was understandable. A woman who cried could be dismissed, handed a rag, sent back to the kitchen. But a woman who pressed her bleeding palm flat against her apron, lifted her chin, and looked Harvey Dalton dead in the eye, without flinching, that kind of woman made men uncomfortable in ways they could not name and would never admit. "I said clean it up," Dalton repeated. His voice had that particular softness that men used when they wanted to remind you they didn't need to shout. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders, and had not done a single day of honest physical labor in at least 20 years. He wore his wealth the way some men wore a weapon, openly, deliberately daring anyone to comment on it. Clara reached down and picked up the largest piece of broken glass. She set it on the bar without a word. Then she picked up the second piece, and the third. And when her hand left a small smear of blood on the worn wooden counter, she wiped it clean with the same practiced efficiency she brought to every task in this building, because this building was the only thing she had left in the world, and she was not going to give Harvey Dalton the satisfaction of watching her fall apart inside it. "You know what I like about you, Clara," Dalton said, turning to address the room like she was part of the entertainment he'd paid for. "You never complain. Most women your situation, they'd be weeping all over the place. But you just keep on going, like a good little mule." The men at the nearest table laughed. Dalton's two companions, ranch hands, who had ridden in from the Caldwell, spread both of them already. 3 drinks past sensible slapped their knees like he'd said something genuinely clever. Clara set the last piece of glass behind the bar and straightened up. "Can I get you another drink, Mr. Dalton?" "See, that's what I mean." He spread his hands toward the room. "That right there. No fire in her at all. Her daddy used to have fire. Remember old Thomas Whitmore man would argue with a fence post if he thought the fence post was wrong." He shook his head with the theatrical sadness of a man performing grief he did not feel. Too bad the drink got him before the sense came back. Something moved behind Clara's eyes. It was brief, the kind of flicker that passes through a person in the half-second before they decide not to say the thing they desperately want to say. Anyone paying close attention might have seen it. But the men in the Silver Moon Saloon that night were not paying close attention to Clara Whitmore's eyes. They never did. "My father," Clara said quietly, "worked himself into the ground for this town. And look what it got him." Dalton tapped the bar twice with 2 fingers. "Whiskey. And make it the good stuff this time. Not whatever that colored water was you poured me last Tuesday." Clara reached for the bottle. Her hand was steady. She had learned steadiness the hard way, through 3 years of nights exactly like this one, through cold winters when the firewood ran out and she burned furniture to keep the pipes from freezing, through summer droughts when the miners didn't come. And she served watered-down drinks to cowboys passing through, and prayed it would be enough to cover what she owed Victor Caldwell at the end of the month. She had learned that steadiness was the only currency a woman in her position truly owned, and she spent it carefully. She poured the whiskey. She did not spill a drop. "You know what your problem is," Dalton said, accepting the glass without thanks. "You think keeping this place running means something, like it's some kind of accomplishment." He looked around the Silver Moon with the expression of a man inspecting a horse he'd already decided wasn't worth buying. "It's a saloon, Clara. Women run saloons when they've got nowhere else to go. It doesn't make you special. It just makes you stuck. Harvey." One of his companions touched his arm. "Let the woman alone. I'm just being honest." Dalton shrugged the hand off. Somebody in this town ought to be honest with her. She's been telling herself a story for years that she's holding something together, that her daddy would be proud that this place means something, and nobody has the courage to tell her the truth. He set his glass down and looked directly at Clara for the first time all evening with something approaching sincerity, which made it worse somehow than the mockery. You're a saloon girl. That's all you are. That's all you're ever going to be. And the sooner you make peace with that, the easier your life is going to get. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when everyone has heard something they know is cruel, but nobody is willing to be the one to say so out loud. Clara looked at Harvey Dalton. She thought about her father, about Thomas Whitmore, who had in fact argued with fence posts, and also with bank managers and territorial commissioners and anyone else who tried to tell him that a man without money had no right to an opinion. She thought about the way he used to sit at the end of this same bar after closing time, tallying numbers in a leather ledger by lamplight, saying, "Clara girl, the numbers always tell the truth if you're willing to listen." She thought about the morning she had come downstairs to find him slumped in that chair, the ledger open to a page she still did not fully understand, and the lamp burned down to nothing. She thought about all of that. And then she said very calmly, "Will there be anything else tonight, Mr. Dalton?" He laughed, and the room laughed with him, because that was easier than doing anything else. Clara turned away. She busied herself at the far end of the bar, rearranging bottles that did not need rearranging, because that was something she could control, and right now she needed very badly to have her hands occupied with something she could control. Her palm had stopped bleeding. The cut wasn't deep. In the morning, she would barely feel it. She was so focused on the bottles that she almost didn't hear the voice from the corner. Almost. "That's enough." 2 words. Quiet enough that they shouldn't have carried across the noise of the saloon, but the room heard them anyway, the way a room hears a sound that does not belong. A note played in the wrong key. A footstep in an empty hallway. Something about those 2 words turned every head toward the corner table near the door. The table that Clara had noticed was occupied when she came on shift tonight, but had not paid particular attention to because she had learned not to pay particular attention to single men who sat alone in corners and watched things. The man sitting there was not especially large. He was lean in the way that men who spend years outdoors tend to be lean, not thin, but pared down the way weather strips a fence post of everything unnecessary. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes that were some color between green and gray and brown, the kind of color that changed depending on what the light was doing. He wore a coat that had seen considerable use. His hat was on the table in front of him. He had both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, which was unusual in a saloon at this hour, and he had apparently been sitting there long enough for the coffee to go cold because he wasn't drinking it. He was just watching. He had been watching, Clara realized, for quite some time. Harvey Dalton turned toward the corner with the slow confidence of a man who has never in his adult life been seriously challenged and has therefore never developed any real instinct for when he should be. "You got something to say, stranger?" The man in the corner did not stand up immediately. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at Dalton with an expression that Clara would spend a long time trying to describe to herself later and finally settle on, as measuring the way a man looks at something he is trying to determine the weight of before he picks it up. Then he stood. He was taller than he had looked sitting down. "I said that's enough." His voice was level, unhurried, carrying the flat cadence of a man who was accustomed to saying things once. "You've made your point. The lady heard you. Everybody in this room heard you. Now sit down and drink your whiskey and let her do her job." Dalton's face did something complicated. He was not a cowardly man exactly. He was simply a man who had operated so long within a system that arranged itself around his comfort that he had forgotten what it felt like to encounter something that didn't. He looked at the stranger in the corner and performed the rapid, unconscious calculation that men perform in these moments. Size, posture, the particular stillness of someone who isn't nervous. And somewhere in that calculation, something gave him pause. "I don't know you," Dalton said. "No, you don't. This town doesn't know you." "That's true." The stranger picked up his hat from the table. "I only rode in 3 days ago, But I've been in here every night, and I've watched how this works, and I've kept my mouth shut because it wasn't my place." He turned the hat in his hands once, then set it on his head. "But there are things a man can watch without saying anything, and then there are things he can't. And this—" He gestured briefly toward Dalton and the laughing men and the bar where Clara stood with her bleeding hand pressed against her apron. "This is the second kind." The room had gone very still. Clara at the far end of the bar had stopped pretending to rearrange bottles. Dalton recovered himself enough to try contempt. "You know who I am, stranger. Harvey Dalton. You own the spread east of town. About 4,000 acres, give or take some of it legally." The stranger's voice didn't change. "I know who you are." Something shifted in Dalton's expression at that give or take. "You'd best watch your mouth. I'm watching it." The stranger looked across the room toward Clara, and for the first time all evening, someone in the Silver Moon Saloon looked at her the way you look at a person rather than an object. That woman has served this town since she was old enough to stand behind a bar. She kept this place running through the drought and through the flood 2 winters ago and through whatever it is this town decided to put her through before I got here. And she did it without asking a single one of you for anything. He looked back at Dalton. "So you're going to sit down, and you're going to stop talking, and you're going to drink your whiskey in silence, and be grateful she poured it for you. Because from where I'm standing, she's worth more than every man laughing in this room, and the fact that not one of you can see that is your failing, not hers." The silence stretched. Dalton's jaw tightened. One of his companions put a hand on his arm again, and this time Dalton didn't shrug it off. The stranger walked to the bar. He set a coin down for his coffee, looked at Clara directly. Not with pity. Not with the performative protectiveness of a man who wants to be seen being gallant, but with something quieter and more serious. The way you look at someone you have genuinely assessed and found worth assessing and said, "I'll take another cup if you don't mind, ma'am." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was not accustomed to being looked at the way he was looking at her. She had catalogued over years of working behind this bar every kind of male attention a woman in her position received: the hungry kind, the contemptuous kind, the pitying kind, the distracted kind. She had developed a comprehensive internal library of male attention, and she knew what to do with every variety of it. She did not have a category for this. "I don't need a stranger fighting my battles," she said. It came out more tired than she intended. Not angry, just tired. He nodded like she'd said something he agreed with. "I know that. Then why?" "Because I wasn't fighting your battle." He accepted the coffee cup she hadn't consciously decided to pour. "I was just saying something that needed to be said. There's a difference." Clara looked at him. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No, ma'am." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "But I know what I've watched for 3 nights, and I know what I just saw. And those things are enough." Dalton left. He didn't make a scene about it. He finished his whiskey, said something to his companions too low to hear, and walked out without looking at the corner table again, which told Clara more about Harvey Dalton than anything he'd said all evening. Men who were genuinely unafraid left loudly. Men who had encountered something that made them unsure of themselves left quietly, and they hated the man who had made them do it. The room slowly returned to its ordinary noise. Clara moved through the rest of her shift with the automatic efficiency that years of practice had made second nature, pouring drinks, counting coin, wiping down the bar, saying the right words to the right people in the right tones. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job. That was never the question. The stranger in the corner stayed until last call. He didn't come back to the bar. He didn't try to talk to her again. He sat with his second cup of coffee going as cold as the first, and watched the room with those gray-green-brown eyes. And when the last customer filed out, he stood, nodded once in her direction, and walked out into the Montana night without another word. Clara locked the door behind him. She stood alone in the Silver Moon Saloon, the saloon her father had built with borrowed money and 30 years of stubborn optimism, the saloon she had kept alive through sheer force of will and a refusal to accept what everyone around her seemed to agree was the inevitable, and she pressed her back against the locked door and listened to the silence. Her hand had stopped bleeding hours ago. She looked at the small dark line across her palm. "You're a saloon girl," Harvey Dalton had said. "That's all you are." Clara had heard that particular sentence in various forms for most of her adult life. She had heard it from customers and creditors, and from men who thought they were being sympathetic when they said it. She had even heard it from women in town, the wives of merchants and ranchers and bank managers who said it with their chins slightly elevated and their voices gently regretful, as if they were telling her a hard truth for her own benefit. She had made a discipline out of not believing it, but disciplines, like everything else, wore thin over time. She put out the last lamp. She climbed the stairs to the small room above the saloon, where she had slept since she was 7 years old, the room with the window that faced east, so she always woke with the sun. The room where her father's leather ledger sat on the shelf beside her bed. The room where she had spent 3 years trying to understand the numbers inside it and always arriving at the same conclusion that something was wrong, that the debts she was paying didn't quite add up to what she remembered, that somewhere in the distance between what she owed and what she was told she owed was a gap that she could not explain. She lay down on her narrow bed without undressing. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about a man who had said, "That's enough," in a voice that made an entire room stop and listen. She thought about the way he had looked at her. Not like a saloon girl, not like someone to be pitied or used or dismissed, like a person worth looking at. Clara Whitmore, who had not cried when Harvey Dalton humiliated her in front of a room full of men, pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes in the dark and took 3 long, slow breaths until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to breathe around. Then she got up, took the leather ledger from the shelf, and began again. His name she learned the next morning from Mabel Greer, who ran the dry goods store and knew everything about everyone within 48 hours of their arrival, was Ethan Blackwood. "Outlaw," Mabel said with the particular relish of a woman delivering important news. She was 61 years old, stout, red-faced, and possessed of an absolutely comprehensive knowledge of territorial gossip. Or used to be anyway. Bounty Hunter first rode for the U.S. Marshal's office out of Billings. Then something happened, nobody knows exactly what, and he stopped. Just stopped. Disappeared for 2-3 years. Now he's here. "Why here?" Clara asked. Mabel shrugged. "Why anywhere men like that end up places. Red Hollow is a place." She squinted at Clara over the counter. "He defended you last night. Word travels fast." "Word in this town doesn't travel. It teleports." Mabel leaned forward. "What did you think of him?" Clara thought about the way he had sat in the corner with cold coffee and watchful eyes for 3 nights running. "I think he minds other people's business," she said. "Most people don't mind yours," Mabel pointed out. Clara paid for her flour and left. She thought about that on the walk back to the Silver Moon. She thought about it while she opened up and swept out and set the chairs down from the tables and checked the inventory and wrote figures in the margins of her working ledger. She thought about it while she went over, for what felt like the 100th time, the record of her father's original agreement with Victor Caldwell's land office. The agreement that had somehow, in the years since her father's death, transformed from a simple business loan into a debt that seemed to grow no matter how diligently she paid it down. The numbers had never made sense. She had simply run out of people to tell that to. Ethan Blackwood came in at noon. Most of the saloon's daytime customers were miners on a short break, eating the beef stew that Clara made from whatever was affordable, drinking 1 beer before going back underground. Blackwood was not a miner. He sat at the counter this time, the corner table was occupied, and waited. Clara set a coffee cup in front of him without being asked. "Thank you," he said. "You're making a habit of this place," she said. "Good coffee." "It's not that good." A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More the shape a smile would leave if it had passed through recently. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Clara wiped down the counter. "What are you doing in Red Hollow, Mr. Blackwood?" "Passing through." "People who are passing through don't come in every night for 3 nights running." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "I might be passing through slowly. Most people who pass through slowly are either waiting for something or looking for something. He looked up at her. Might be both, he said. Clara looked back at him with the direct assessing gaze she had developed over years of reading men across a bar, reading who was angry, who was drunk, who was going to make trouble, who was harmless, who was carrying something heavier than it showed. She had gotten very good at reading men. Ethan Blackwood was harder to read than most, not because he was closed off exactly, more because what was there was simpler and more direct than she was used to, and simplicity and directness were not qualities she encountered frequently enough to recognize immediately. Last night, she said, you told Harvey Dalton that some of his land was legally his, give or take. Blackwood said nothing. That's a specific thing to say about a man you've only known for 3 days. I did some asking around before I said it, about Harvey Dalton specifically. A pause. About Red Hollow generally. Clara set down her cloth. She looked at him for a long moment, not the reading look, something different, something more direct. Victor Caldwell, she said. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness changed quality the way still water changes when something moves underneath it. What about him? He said. Is that what you're looking for? Clara asked. Or waiting for? The noon rush had thinned out. The miners had gone back underground. The saloon was quiet enough that she could hear the creak of the sign above the door, moving in the wind outside. Ethan Blackwood looked at his coffee for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. Miss Whitmore, he said, how long have you been paying Victor Caldwell? Clara's hands resting on the bar went very still. 3 years, she said. And before that your father, 8 years before he died. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. 11 years altogether. And how much do you owe now? She named the figure. Something moved behind his eyes. That measuring look again, but turned inward, this time turned toward a calculation she couldn't see. You know that number is wrong, he said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at him. I know the ledger doesn't add up, she said carefully. I know what my father thought he signed, and what Caldwell says he signed don't match. I know that every time I get close to paying off what I'm told I owe, the number moves. She paused. What I don't know is how to prove it. Has anyone ever looked at the original agreement? Caldwell says the original is in his office. He's shown me copies. Copies, Blackwood said, can be altered. Yes, Clara said. They can. The words sat between them. Outside, the wind moved the sign again. Inside, the afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor toward the far wall. Why are you in Red Hollow, Mr. Blackwood? Clara asked again. And this time, instead of passing through slowly or looking and waiting, he said something that was not quite an answer, but was something more than nothing. Because, he said, the last town I was in had a man like Victor Caldwell in it. And by the time anyone figured out what he'd done, there were 6 families who had nothing left. Clara looked at him. And what happened to that man? She asked. Ethan Blackwood picked up his coffee cup. He went to prison, he said, and drank. Clara thought about that. She thought about her father's ledger on the shelf beside her bed. She thought about 11 years of payments that had somehow never been enough. She thought about the number that moved and the copies that could be altered and the original agreement that she had never seen with her own eyes. She thought about the gap, that persistent, infuriating gap between what she owed and what she was told she owed. She took the coffee pot and refilled his cup without being asked. The silver moon closes at midnight, she said. If you wanted to look at my father's records, that would be a reasonable time to do it. Blackwood looked up at her. That's a private thing, he said. Letting someone look at your father's records? Yes, Clara said. It is. She moved away down the bar. He stayed until midnight. And when the last customer left and she locked the door and turned the lamp down low and brought the ledger down from upstairs and set it on the bar. Between them, Clara Whitmore watched Ethan Blackwood go through her father's numbers with the careful, patient attention of a man who knew what he was looking for, and she felt for the first time in 3 years something she had almost stopped believing she was allowed to feel. Not hope exactly. Something more like the shadow that hope casts when it's still a long way off, but moving in your direction. "There," he said an hour later, pressing his finger against a number in the margin. "Your father wrote this in his own hand. You see this figure?" Clara leaned over the bar. "Yes." That's what he actually agreed to. "Now look at this." He moved to the copy Caldwell had provided. "Same figure, but this digit right here is different." Clara looked. The number was wrong. She had looked at that number dozens of times, and never caught. It had always been looking at the total, at the monthly payments, at the endless downstream arithmetic of what she owed. And she had never once looked at this one, originating digit, and noticed that it was wrong. She felt the floor shift under her feet. Not literally, figuratively. The way the world reorganizes itself when you understand something you should have understood years ago and didn't. "He changed it," she said. Her voice came out strange. "Yes," Ethan said. "This whole time." She stared at the number. "This whole time I didn't owe—" "No," he said. "You didn't." The lamp flickered. Outside the Silver Moon Saloon, Red Hollow slept the ordinary sleep of a frontier town in the middle of the night, the horses in the livery, the miners in their bunks, the respectable families in their houses with the curtains drawn. Everyone dreaming their ordinary dreams of the ordinary future they expected to have. And inside at the bar, Clara Whitmore stood over her father's ledger and understood for the first time the shape of the thing that had been done to her. She did not cry. She stood very straight. She pressed both hands flat against the bar and breathed slowly and looked at the number that had been changed and thought about 11 years and thought about her father and thought about Victor Caldwell's office with its polished desk and its framed documents on the walls and the way he had always looked at her when she came to make her payments. That particular look of a man who knows something the person across the desk does not know and has no intention of telling them. "I need to see the original," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Yes," Ethan said. "You do. It'll be in his office." "Most likely." She looked up from the ledger. "Will you help me?" He looked at her with those gray-green-brown eyes that changed with the light, and she thought he was going to say something careful and qualified, something measured about risk and difficulty, and the limits of what a former bounty hunter passing through slowly could reasonably be asked to do. Instead, he said simply, "Yes." Clara Whitmore looked at the man across the bar, the outlaw who had called her worth more than a room full of men, who had drunk cold coffee in her saloon for 3 nights running, who had gone through her father's numbers with the patience of someone who genuinely cared what they found, and she made a decision. She picked up the ledger. She put it under her arm. "Then we start tomorrow," she said. And for the first time in 3 years, the gap between what she owed and what she was told she owed didn't feel like an impossible distance. It felt like something she could cross. The next morning came cold and gray, the way Montana mornings did in late October, when the season had already made up its mind but hadn't bothered to inform anyone officially. Clara was behind the bar before sunrise. She had not slept. Not really. She had lain on her narrow bed with her father's ledger open across her chest and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind off the mountains and thought about a single changed digit. One number altered so subtly that she had looked past it dozens of times and what that number meant about 11 years of her life. She was not angry yet. She understood that the anger was coming. The way you understand a storm is coming. Before you can see it, something in the pressure of the air, something in the quality of the silence. But right now, in the pre-dawn dark of the Silver Moon Saloon, she was running on something colder and more useful than anger. She was running on clarity. The morning customers came and went. Miners, mostly a few ranch hands, the 2 brothers from the lumber operation, up near the pass, who always ordered the same thing and never spoke to each other the entire time they were in the building. Clara served them all with the same practiced competence she brought to every shift, and she watched the door and she waited. Ethan Blackwood came in at 8:30. He sat at the counter. She poured his coffee before he asked for it. He looked at her face for a long moment, without saying anything, the way a person looks at something to take a reading of it, and whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, because he picked up the cup and said, "You didn't sleep." "No. Neither did I." She looked at him. "What were you doing?" "Asking questions." He set the cup down. Quietly. "To people who don't talk to Caldwell. And I think the problem is bigger than one change number in one ledger." He said it evenly, without drama, the way you say something that is simply true and needs to be heard clearly. "I think your father wasn't the only one." Clara's hands went still on the bar. "How many?" She said, "I talked to 4 people last night. Hector Ruiz the blacksmith, old Margaret Phelps out on the East Road, the Donovan brothers, who lost their grazing rights 2 years ago." He paused. "And the widow Castle, whose husband died owing Caldwell a debt she can't explain and can't pay off no matter what she does." Clara knew every one of those names. She had poured drinks for Hector Ruiz for years. Margaret Phelps had brought her a pie the winter after her father died. The Donovan brothers she had watched lose everything so gradually it looked almost ordinary until it was finished. And Ruth Castle. Ruth, who came in on Saturday evenings sometimes, and sat at the end of the bar and nursed a single drink for 2 hours because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't that house with its silences and its unpayable numbers. "They all talk to you," she said. "They talked to me because I told them about the number in your father's ledger." He looked at her steadily. "I hope that was all right." She considered that. "Was it?" he asked, and there was something in the question, not apology, not quite, but an acknowledgement that this was her story, and he was moving through it carefully. "Yes," she said, "it was. Each of them has a version of the same thing. Agreements that shifted, debts that grew, numbers and copies that don't match what they remember signing." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Caldwell's been running this for at least a decade, maybe longer." A decade. Clara did the arithmetic without meaning to. A decade meant before her father ever walked into Caldwell's land office. A decade meant this had been the design from the beginning, not an opportunistic adjustment. Not Caldwell seeing a weakened man and deciding to take advantage, but a system. A method, a practiced and deliberate machine for taking things from people who had no one willing to stop him. "The original documents," she said. "If they still exist, they'll be in his office. He'd keep them. Men like Caldwell keep everything they need the originals to know how far they've altered the copies." He paused. "The question is getting to them." "His office is in the land registry building," Clara said. "He's there every morning at 9. He leaves for lunch at noon. He has one clerk boy named Petey Walsh who takes his lunch at the same time." Ethan looked at her. "You've been watching his schedule," he said. "I've been thinking about this for 3 years," she said. "I just didn't have anyone to think about it with." Something moved in his face at that. Brief. Gone before she could name it. "We'll need more than the 2 of us," he said. "If we take those documents, Caldwell is going to know immediately who took them. And he has reach in this town. He's got Dalton, and Dalton has men." "Hector Ruiz has men too," Clara said. "The blacksmith doesn't just know everyone in Red Hollow. Everyone owes him something, a repaired wheel, a reshod horse, a debt not called in when times were hard. If Hector is willing." "He is," Ethan said. "I already asked him." Clara stopped. "You already?" "Last night when I told him about the ledger, he said, and I'm quoting directly here, that he had been waiting for someone to do something about Victor Caldwell since the year his brother-in-law lost his homestead claim, and if anyone needed his arms and his forge and his extremely loud voice, they were available." A beat. "He also offered to come along and be physically intimidating, which I told him we might not need, but that I would keep in mind." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had the sensation, which was becoming familiar, and still felt strange, of being in the presence of someone who was genuinely on her side, not performing helpfulness, not managing her, not organizing things in order to be owed something later, but simply and practically putting pieces together because he had looked at a problem and decided it needed to be solved. She was not accustomed to that. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 9:15. When Caldwell is at his desk and his clerk is running the morning errands. The front door of the land registry building has a lock that I can work in under 3 minutes. There's a rear window that opens from the outside if you know the trick, which Hector does, because he installed the hardware 10 years ago. He picked up his coffee. "And I'll need you at the back door, because you know your father's handwriting, and you know exactly what you're looking for. That's not something I can do alone." "You've been planning this since last night," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the night I came in here and watched Harvey Dalton tell you what you were worth." The flatness in his voice had an edge to it now, something brief and controlled. "I just needed the numbers to tell me I was right about what was going on." The morning light had shifted. The last of the early customers were gone. The silver moon was quiet and still, and full of the particular quality of silence that exists when two people are figuring out how much they trust each other. "Mr. Blackwood," Clara said. "Ethan," he said. "If we're going to break into the land registry building together, you might as well use my first name, Ethan." She said it carefully, like testing weight on a step. "Why does this matter to you? You rode into Red Hollow 3 days ago. You don't know me. You don't know these people. You have no stake in what happens here." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned in a short time that his silences were not evasion. They were the spaces he gave himself before he said something true. "The last town I was in," he said, "I watched a man like Caldwell ruin 6 families over 4 years before anyone did anything. And the reason nobody did anything sooner is because every person who knew what was happening looked at what it would cost them and decided it was someone else's problem." He looked down at the cup. "I was one of those people. For a year and a half I knew something was wrong with the numbers, and I kept my mouth shut, because I had reasons that seemed important at the time." He looked up. "By the time I did something about it, 2 of those families had left the territory. One man had put a gun in his mouth." The room was very quiet. "I'm not passing through slowly," he said. "I'm here because I heard about Caldwell 3 towns back from a man who used to live in Red Hollow and left with nothing and told me where the nothing had come from. And I came here to do what I didn't do last time." He paused. "That's the whole truth of it." Clara looked at him. She thought about all the versions of that answer she might have gotten. The vague version, the deflecting version, the version designed to make himself sound noble without revealing anything real. She thought about how easy it would have been for a man to give her any of those versions, and how rare it was to receive the plain one instead. "All right," she said. "All right. Tomorrow morning, 9:15. She held out her hand across the bar. He looked at it for the half-second, then took it. His grip was firm and brief and completely businesslike. "All right," he said. She let go. She turned back to her work. She did not let herself think about the warmth his hand had left behind, or the fact that it was still there an hour later when she was alone in the kitchen cutting potatoes and the morning had gone back to being ordinary and cold. She was not under any circumstances going to think about that. She thought about it for the rest of the day. That afternoon she went to see Ruth Castle. Ruth lived in a house 2 streets back from the main road that had been her husband's house before it became hers by way of his death, and which she maintained with a kind of desperate tidiness that Clara recognized as the thing you do when everything else feels out of control. The yard was swept. The curtains were straight. The step was scrubbed. And Ruth herself opened the door in a clean dress with her hair pinned up, which on a Tuesday afternoon Clara knew was effort rather than habit. "Clara," Ruth said. Her voice was careful the way it always was, the wariness of a woman who had learned that surprises were usually the bad kind. "I need to talk to you," Clara said. "About Caldwell." Ruth's face went still. "Come in," she said after a moment. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table with 2 cups of tea between them, and Clara told her about the number. The changed digit. The gap between what Thomas Whitmore had agreed to and what Victor Caldwell had recorded him agreeing to. She told it plainly without drama, the way you tell someone a thing you need them to understand rather than feel. Ruth's hands wrapped around her cup tightened. James always said the numbers were wrong, she said. Her voice was very quiet. He said it from the beginning that what he'd signed didn't match what they told him he owed. I thought... She stopped. I thought maybe he'd misremembered. Or misunderstood. James wasn't always careful with numbers. She looked up. He was a good man, but he trusted people he shouldn't have, and I spent so long after he was gone, being angry at him for that, and now you're telling me... He was right, Clara said. Ruth's chin moved. He was right, Clara said again firmly because Ruth needed to hear it twice. The numbers were wrong because Caldwell made them wrong. It wasn't James's fault. It wasn't yours. The sound Ruth made was not quite a word. Clara reached across the table and covered Ruth's hands with her own. I need you to find your husband's original paperwork, she said. Whatever you signed, whatever you kept, I need to know if the same thing was done to yours. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. If it was, she said, what happens then? We prove it, Clara said. All of it. Every family he's done this to. And then we take it somewhere it can't be ignored. Somewhere like where? Ruth's voice was skeptical. Gently skeptical. The skepticism of a woman who has reached the age where she knows that the truth and justice are not the same thing, and often don't even live in the same county. Caldwell has the sheriff. He plays cards with Judge Henley every second Friday. He's got half this town, Clara. He doesn't have all of it, Clara said. Ruth looked at her. There's a man, Clara said. He came to Red Hollow 3 days ago. He has experience with this, with Caldwell's kind of scheme, the way the numbers work, the way the documents get altered. He was a bounty hunter. He knows how territorial law works. Is he trustworthy? Clara thought about cold coffee and a man who had told her the whole truth when the easy thing would have been to tell her half of it. I think so, she said. You think, I'm being careful. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then nodded once slowly, like a woman lowering a weight she's been holding above her head for a very long time. I'll find the papers, she said. Clara squeezed her hands and let go. Walking back to the Silver Moon that evening, Clara passed Caldwell's land registry building. It was a solid structure, well-maintained, with the particular look of a building that a man has invested in because it is the outward expression of how he thinks of himself. The windows were clean. The sign was freshly painted. The whole thing projected reliability and permanence and the orderly functioning of legitimate business. Clara looked at it. She thought about what was inside it. She thought about her father at 2 a.m. with a lamp burning low and numbers that wouldn't add up, trying to understand something that had been designed so he couldn't understand it. She thought about James Castle, who had been right and been told he was wrong until he stopped trusting his own arithmetic. She thought about the Donovan brothers and Margaret Phelps and Hector Ruiz's brother-in-law who had packed up everything he owned and left the territory with nothing. She kept walking. She did not look at the building for long. That night, the Silver Moon was busy. A cattle outfit from up north had come through with money to spend, and Clara worked until midnight without stopping moving through the crowd with the automatic fluency of long practice. She poured, she counted. She broke up one argument before it became a fight. She removed one man who had confused rude with charming, and she kept track of everything happening in the room simultaneously, the way she always did, because that was the job, and she was good at the job, and she had always been good at the job, even when the job was the only thing she had. She caught herself twice looking at the corner table near the door. Ethan wasn't there. She told herself she was only checking because she had gotten used to him being there, and that was true, and it was also only part of the truth, and she was aware of that, and kept moving anyway, because a busy saloon on a Tuesday night was not the appropriate location for an internal examination of complicated feelings. He came in at 10, not to the corner table. He sat at the far end of the bar, where there was space-ordered coffee, with the composure of a man who understood how ridiculous it was to order coffee in a saloon full of men drinking whiskey, and had long since stopped caring, and waited until the crowd thinned before he leaned forward slightly, and said low and even, "Caldwell had a meeting tonight." Clara kept her expression ordinary. "With who?" "Sheriff Breaker and 2 men I didn't recognize. They were at Caldwell's house, not the office. I watched from the road for about 20 minutes. He paused. I don't know what was said, but Caldwell looked unhappy when they left, and one of the men I didn't recognize had the look of someone who'd been hired for a specific purpose. The hair on Clara's arms went up under her sleeves. What kind of purpose? The kind that comes with a fee and doesn't leave a paper trail. He said it quietly. Someone has been asking questions in this town, Clara. Not me, I've been careful. But someone has been asking the wrong questions to the wrong people, and Caldwell knows it. Who? Ethan's jaw was tight. I think it might be someone Hector talked to before I had the chance to warn him to be discreet. Clara set down the glass she was holding. Is Hector in danger? Not tonight. But we need to move faster than tomorrow morning. He looked at her steadily. Can you close early tonight? I've never closed early in 3 years. I know. She looked at the room. There were still 12 customers. 3 of them were regulars who would be here until she physically removed them. 4 of the cattle outfit men were deep in a card game that would probably run another 2 hours. She looked back at Ethan. Give me 40 minutes, she said. She gave them 35. She announced last call at 11:15, cited a family matter that required her attention, and moved through the room with such calm certainty that nobody argued because Clara Whitmore was not a woman people argued with when her voice had that particular quality, the quality of a decision already made rather than a request being extended. By 11:50, the silver moon was empty. She locked the door. Ethan was still at the bar. Tell me everything, she said. He did. Caldwell had been expecting something to shift. That was what the meeting with Sheriff Breaker meant. Not a specific threat, not yet, but an awareness that something was moving in the margins of his operation, and a man who had spent a decade building a careful system of fraud was not going to wait until the threat was specific before he responded to it. He was the kind of man who maintained control by responding to problems before they fully developed, which was in fact the same instinct that had made his scheme so effective and so durable. He read situations early, and he acted on what he read, which meant they had less time than they'd thought. The documents, Clara said. His office. Can we go tonight? His office won't be empty tonight, not after that meeting. Ethan shook his head. He'll have someone there. Possibly Breaker, possibly one of those men. Then what? Then we go to the secondary source. He looked at her. Hector Ruiz told me something tonight before I came here. He said Caldwell has a strongbox, not in the office, in a private room at the back of his house. Hector knows because he made the hardware for it 5 years ago. A lock mechanism custom designed that Caldwell paid extra for specifically to make sure nobody knew what was in it. Clara stared at him. Hector made the lock, she said. Hector made the lock. Ethan confirmed with the ghost of something in his voice that was not quite humor, but was close to it. And Hector, being Hector, remembers exactly how it works. You're telling me Victor Caldwell built his entire operation on a strongbox that the blacksmith can open. I'm telling you that men who think they're smarter than everyone around them tend to make exactly that kind of mistake. He paused. We go tonight, not the office, the house. Clara thought about it. She thought about Caldwell's meeting with the sheriff, and the men with the specific purposes and no paper trails, and Hector who might already have talked to the wrong people. She thought about Ruth Castle's face at the kitchen table when Clara had said he was right. She thought about the changed number in the ledger and 11 years of payments that had built this man's comfort and power out of her father's labor and her own. All right, she said. She went upstairs, changed into darker clothing, and came back down in under 4 minutes. Ethan looked at her. Fast, he said. I've been making decisions quickly my whole life, she said. Let's go. Hector Ruiz was waiting for them in the alley behind the blacksmith's forge, his massive frame reduced to a shadow in the dark, his breath fogging in the cold air. He had brought a second man, his nephew, a quiet young man named Luis, who had the economical movements of someone accustomed to working in tight spaces. Clara, Hector said low. He had the particular respectful gravity that big men sometimes have in difficult situations, the awareness that their size makes reassurance necessary. "You holding up?" "I'm holding up," she said. "Thank you for this, Hector." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when we're done." He looked at Ethan. "You're certain about the timing?" "His housekeeper leaves at 10. He lives alone. The men from tonight's meeting went back toward the Caldwell spread, not the house." Ethan kept his voice low. "We have a window." Hector nodded. "Then we move." Caldwell's house was at the north end of town, where the road widened and the properties spread out, and the houses got larger and better built. The houses of men who had decided their comfort required more space than other people's comfort. It was a large house, well maintained, the kind of house that said, "I have won" in every architectural detail. They went in from the back. Hector's hands on the lock mechanism were the same hands that could bend iron at his forge, but they moved with a delicate precision that Clara watched with something like awe, the practiced certainty of a craftsman who understood every piece of the thing he had built. The lock opened in under 2 minutes. They were inside. The private room Hector had described was at the back of the house, small, windowless, the kind of room that had been added as an afterthought or a necessity. The strongbox sat against the far wall, solid and substantial, and entirely ignorant of the fact that the man who had made it was currently crouching in front of it. "Give me 3 minutes," Hector said. He took 2. The strongbox opened, and Clara, holding the lamp they had brought, leaned forward and saw what was inside it. Documents. Dozens of them. Organized with the meticulous care of a man who understood their value precisely because he understood what he had done to obtain them. Original agreements carefully preserved the ink clear and unaltered the records of what people had actually signed before Victor Caldwell's copies had been made with their subtly changed numbers and their quietly shifted figures. Clara's hands were shaking. She did not have time to register what that meant about her composure, because there was no time for composure right now. She went through the documents with focused, efficient speed. This one, yes, that one, yes, here, and her hands were shaking, but her eyes were not, and her memory of her father's handwriting was absolutely clear. She found it. Her father's original agreement. She unfolded it carefully, tilted it toward the lamp, and read the number that Thomas Whitmore had actually signed beside. The number was what it should have been. The copy that Caldwell had shown her for 3 years had changed a single digit. 1 digit compounded over 11 years of payments had been the difference between a debt her father could have paid in 4 years and a debt that would have consumed Clara's entire life. Her hands were shaking hard now. "Clara," Ethan's voice low and close, "we need to move." "I know." She did not look up from the document. "I need 1 more minute." She took 1 more minute. She found Ruth Castle's husband's name. She found the Donovan brothers. She found 3 names she hadn't expected and would need to tell people about later. She folded the documents with careful hands. "Got everything," Ethan said. "Everything that matters," she said. "Then we go now." They went. They were 2 streets away from Caldwell's house when they heard it. The distant sound of a door voices the specific purposeful noise of men who have been somewhere and are now going somewhere else. "Move," Ethan said quietly. They moved. In the alley behind Hector's forge, breathing cold air in the dark, Clara pressed her back against the wall and held the folded documents against her chest and listened to her own heartbeat, which was very loud and very fast and entirely justified given the circumstances. Hector appeared beside her, Luis behind him. "You have them?" Hector asked. "I have them," she said. "All of them." She looked at the documents in her hands. The originals. The truth. 11 years and 6 families and a man who had built his entire position in this town on the distance between what was real and what he had convinced everyone to believe. "Enough of them," she said. Hector let out a breath that was almost a laugh, barely audible, the sound of a very large man doing something carefully quiet. Ethan was watching the far end of the alley. "The men from tonight's meeting," he said, not turning around. "They're not going back to the spread." Clara followed his gaze. 2 figures at the far end of the alley. Standing. not moving. The stillness of men who are watching rather than passing through. "They know," she said. "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or maybe Caldwell is just cautious." A pause. "Either way, we don't go back to the Silver Moon tonight. Not directly." "Then where?" He turned to look at her. "Margaret Phelps," he said. "You said she's on the East Road. Caldwell won't expect that, and she's far enough out." Clara nodded. "She'll take us in," she said. They went east through the dark, staying off the main road, and Clara held her father's truth against her chest and kept walking, and she did not shake. She did not slow down, and she did not look back at the town that had laughed at her. She was done looking back. Margaret Phelps did not ask questions when 4 people appeared at her door at midnight. She opened the door, looked at Clara's face, looked at the folded documents pressed against Clara's chest, looked at Ethan, standing slightly behind and to the left, with the watchful stillness of a man covering a retreat, and she stepped back and said, "Coffee's on the stove. Come in." That was Margaret Phelps. 71 years old, built like someone who had been tested by decades of Montana weather and found the weather wanting, with hands that had done every kind of work a person could do on the frontier and eyes that had seen most of what that work produced. She had lived on the East Road for 40 years. She had outlasted 2 husbands, 1 drought, 1 flood, and Victor Caldwell's repeated attempts to buy her land, which she had declined with a consistency and a vocabulary that had apparently impressed even him. She poured coffee without being asked and sat down at the head of her kitchen table and waited. Clara spread the documents on the table. Margaret looked at them without touching them for a long moment. Then she reached out and picked up the one with her name on it, the original agreement she had signed 12 years ago for a water rights arrangement that had somehow in Caldwell's copy transformed into something that gave him the right to charge her an annual fee that existed nowhere in the document she was holding right now. Her jaw tightened. "He changed the clause," she said. "Flat. Certain." "Yes," Clara said. "I knew it." Margaret set the document down. She pressed both hands flat on the table. "I knew it. James Whitmore, your father? God rest him. He told me something was wrong with the water rights agreement the year before he died. He said, 'Margaret, this isn't what we signed.' And I told him he was mistaken because I didn't want to believe it, and he looked at me with that particular look he had and said, 'The numbers always tell the truth.' Margaret and I was too afraid of what the truth was to listen." She looked at Clara. "I owe your father an apology." "He'd have said you don't," Clara said. "He'd have said you survived, and that was the important part." Margaret's expression did something complicated and then settled into something resolute. "What do we do with these?" "We take them to Helena," Ethan said. "The Territorial Commissioner's office. Not the Sheriff Breaker is in Caldwell's pocket and everyone at this table knows it. We go over his head over Judge Henley's head to someone who doesn't owe Caldwell a card game." "Helena is 2 days' ride," Margaret said. "Yes." "Caldwell will know what's missing from that strongbox by morning." "Yes." "Then he'll know where these are going." "Yes," Ethan said. "Which means we move before he can get ahead of us." Margaret looked at him for a long moment with the appraising look of a woman who has spent 7 decades deciding which men were worth trusting. "You know how to handle a rifle?" she asked him. "Well enough. I have 3 horses. Mine's not fast, but she's steady on rough ground, which matters more after the first hour." She stood up. "I'll pack food. You—" She pointed at Ethan. "Check the horses. You." She pointed at Hector. "There's a loose shoe on the gray fix-it before we go anywhere." She looked at Luis. "You're young, and your eyes are better than mine. Stand at the gate and watch the road." Then she looked at Clara. "Those documents," she said. "Yes, you hold on to them, the whole way." Margaret's voice was firm. "You found them. You understand what's in them. They stay with you." Clara looked down at the papers in her hands. She thought about her father at 2 a.m. with his lamp burning low. She thought about 3 years of payments that had built nothing. She thought about Ruth Castle's face when she'd said he was right. "They stay with me," she said. They left Margaret's property at 2 in the morning, which meant they rode the first hour in complete darkness, with only the stars for light, which meant it was cold and slow, and required the particular focused attention of people who understand that rushing in the dark is how you break a horse's leg on a hidden rock and end up on foot, with men coming up behind you. Ethan rode on the outside. Clara rode in the middle. Margaret, who knew this terrain better than any of them, rode at the front and set the pace. And Hector brought up the rear with the specific solid presence of a large man who has decided to be useful and is being useful without discussion. Luis had stayed in Red Hollow. He had a reason for staying. He had a wife, a child, work at the forge that couldn't disappear overnight without raising questions, and Ethan had asked him to do something specific instead: watch Caldwell's house. Watch who came and went, and if anything happened that looked like it was moving toward Margaret's property, or the East Road, get word to Ruth Castle, who would get word out in the quiet way that women in small towns have always gotten word out when the official channels belonged to someone else. Clara had not known until that moment that Ethan had thought to include Ruth. She had not known until that moment how carefully he had been building the pieces of this around the people who were most vulnerable if it went wrong. She thought about that as they rode through the dark, and she held the documents inside her coat, close against her ribs, and she listened to the sound of 4 horses moving through Montana in the middle of the night, and she did not let herself think about what happened if Caldwell moved faster than they did. She thought about it anyway. Dawn found them 6 miles east of Red Hollow, on a ridge road that looked back over the valley, and Clara pulled her horse up briefly and looked back because she could not help herself. The town was small from here. You could see the whole shape of it, the main street, the church steeple, the dark rectangle of the silver moon with its unlit windows, the long, low line of the mining operation up toward the north. It looked ordinary. It looked like every other frontier town she had ever seen, described in the newspapers that came through the towns that represented the American promise, the idea that a person could come to open country and build something from nothing and have it mean what they built it to mean. She thought about Harvey Dalton telling her she was just a saloon girl. She thought about all the men who had agreed with him, or laughed or stayed quiet, which was its own kind of agreement. She turned her horse back toward the road. "How much of a head start do we have?" she asked. "Enough," Ethan said from beside her. He had pulled up when she did. "Caldwell's housekeeper comes at 7. She'll find the strongbox before she finds him. He'll need time to understand what's missing, more time to decide how to respond. And the sheriff. Breaker moves slow when he's not sure what he's protecting." A pause. "We have time, but not unlimited time." "Then let's use what we have," Clara said. They rode. The first sign that something was wrong came at mid-morning on the lower road where it curved around the base of the first real hill outside Red Hollow's valley. Hector heard it first. "Riders," he said. Not loud, just the word dropped into the air behind them. Clara felt her stomach drop. Ethan turned his horse in a single smooth motion, looking back down the road. 2 riders, coming fast. Too fast for travelers, too purposeful for coincidence. "Caldwell's men," Clara said. "Can't tell yet." Ethan's voice was level. "Hector, I see them. Margaret, take Clara off the road. There's a draw to the left, go into it and stop moving." "I know where the draw is," Margaret said, already moving. "I've lived here 40 years. Clara went with her because the documents went with Clara, and getting the documents off the road was the only thing that mattered right now. She moved her horse into the draw, which was a shallow cut in the hillside thick with dried brush, and stopped there beside Margaret and listened. The riders came fast, and then they slowed, and there were voices. Ethan's voice, level and unhurried, and another voice, higher and younger, that Clara didn't immediately recognize. Then Ethan said, "Clara." She came back out of the draw. The 2 riders were Luis and a boy she recognized as P.D. Walsh, Victor Caldwell's clerk, 17 years old, with a face that was currently experiencing the specific wide-eyed urgency of someone who has ridden very hard and very fast and needs to say something important before they fall off their horse. "Miss Whitmore," Petey said, breathing hard. I need to. He stopped, gathered himself. Mr. Caldwell knows. He came to the office at 6 this morning, not his usual 9, and he already knew the strongbox had been opened. He had Sheriff Breaker there before 7. And the 2 men from last night, the ones I didn't know, they've gone south on the main road, not the east road. Clara stared at him. Petey, she said carefully. Why are you here? The boy looked at her with the expression of someone who has made a decision and needs the other person to understand the weight of it. Because I've been working for Mr. Caldwell for 8 months, he said. And I've been copying documents for him for 8 months, and I'm 17 years old. But I'm not stupid, Miss Whitmore, and I've known for at least 4 of those 8 months that the numbers in the originals and the numbers in the copies I made weren't the same. His voice was shaking slightly. And I kept doing it because he paid me, and I needed the money, and I told myself it wasn't my business. And then Luis came to my mother's house this morning and told me what you'd found, and He stopped again. I can't be the person who said nothing. Not anymore. Silence. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word. Hector looked at the boy with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he had already assessed. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Petey Walsh, 17 years old, shaking on his horse in the cold morning air, with the specific misery of someone who has been carrying a guilt too heavy for his age and has finally decided to put it down. The South Road, she said. Caldwell's men went south. Yes, ma'am. They're going around to cut off the road to Helena. That's what I think, Petey said. Yes. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan was already doing the calculation. She could see at the roots the timing, the distance. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was working something through and the answer wasn't good. There's another road to Helena, Margaret said. Not the main road. Old Trapper route goes through the high pass. Takes longer, but it comes out above the main road north of wherever they'd set up. How much longer? Ethan asked. 6 hours, maybe 7. Rough going. Margaret looked at the sky. We'd be riding through dark again. Can you do it? Margaret gave him a look that said she had been navigating this territory since before he was born, and she would thank him not to ask unnecessary questions. I can do it, she said. Then we go, Ethan said. He looked at Luis and Petey. You two. We go back, Luis said. He exchanged a look with Petey. We're more useful in town. Ethan nodded. Find Ruth Castle. Tell her what's happening. Tell her to gather whoever else is willing quietly, no announcement, and be at the Silver Moon by the time we get back. When will that be? Luis asked. 3 days, Ethan said. Maybe 4. Luis nodded. He looked at Clara. We'll be there, Miss Whitmore. Thank you, she said. Both of you. Petey Walsh looked at her with his young, miserable, honest face. I'm sorry, he said. For the copies. For the time I... Petey. Clara cut him off gently. You're here now. That's what matters. He straightened slightly on his horse. Nodded. They split at the ridge, Luis and Petey back toward Red Hollow and Clara and the others up toward the high pass that Margaret knew from 40 years of living inside this landscape. The climb was hard. The trail was narrow and steep and had not been traveled recently, and the horses felt the difficulty of it in their breathing and their reluctant footfalls, and Clara felt it in her hands and her back, and the cold that got worse as they gained elevation. She kept one hand on the reins and one hand pressed against the documents inside her coat. Beside her, the trail was wide enough for 2 horses side by side. In some sections Ethan rode, in his particular quality of silence, the silence that was attentive rather than absent. Petey Walsh, Clara said after a long, quiet stretch. He's going to face consequences for what he did, even if this works. Probably, Ethan said. He came anyway. He did. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how do you know when something is worth the cost? He rode in silence long enough that she thought he might not answer. You don't know in advance, he said finally. You just know what you can live with after. He paused. That boy can't live with silence anymore. You can see it in his face. Some costs are higher than the thing you're trying to avoid. Clara thought about that. She thought about 3 years of telling herself that the numbers were wrong and not saying anything because there was no one to say it to, and how that silence had accumulated inside her like a debt of its own, something she owed herself that she had not paid. I stayed quiet too, she said, for years. You stayed alive, he said. There's a difference. Is there? Clara. His voice was direct. A woman alone running a saloon with a fraudulent debt and a sheriff in Caldwell's pocket. What exactly were you supposed to do? Something. You did do something. The moment you had someone to do it with, you moved. Same night. A pause. That's not silence. That's waiting for conditions that made action possible. She looked at him. He was looking at the trail ahead, his profile steady against the gray sky. You're very good at reframing things, she said. I'm telling you what's true, he said. Whether it sounds like reframing is a different question. She faced forward again. The trail narrowed, and they rode single file for a while, and Clara had nothing to do but hold on and thinking, led her back to the documents against her ribs, and the documents led her back to her father, and her father led her somewhere she hadn't let herself go in a very long time. Thomas Whitmore had been a difficult man to be the daughter of, not cruel. She needed to be precise about this, because imprecision about her father was a thing she had been guilty of for years, romanticizing him in death in ways she had not managed in life. He had not been cruel. He had been stubborn and proud and occasionally blind to things he didn't want to see. And he had trusted the wrong man because that trust had been carefully engineered, and because Thomas Whitmore had believed in fair dealing and had sometimes applied that belief to people who did not deserve it. But he had also been the man who taught her numbers, who had sat with her at this same bar when she was 9 years old and shown her how a ledger worked, not just the adding and subtracting, but the principle behind it. The idea that if you recorded things honestly, the record would always tell you the truth. Numbers don't lie. Clara girl, he had said, people lie. But if you write down what actually happened, the numbers will always tell you what the people won't. He had given her the tool she needed to uncover what had been done to them both. He just hadn't known he was doing it. Clara pressed her hand harder against the documents. For you, she thought. All of it for you. They reached the high pass at early afternoon, and the cold at elevation was significant, the kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays there, that makes you understand in a physical way why the mountains were respected and not merely admired. Margaret navigated without hesitation, which was its own kind of impressive, the deep bone memory of a woman who had traveled this route in conditions Clara didn't want to imagine. They stopped at a rock outcropping to rest the horses and eat the food Margaret had packed, and it was during that stop that Ethan said quietly and without preamble, I need to tell you something. Clara looked at him. Hector and Margaret were with the horses out of easy earshot. The man who told me about Red Hollow, Ethan said. 3 towns back, the one who had lived here and left with nothing. Yes. His name was Daniel Whitmore. Clara went very still. Your father's brother, Ethan said. Your uncle. He lost a parcel of land to Caldwell 9 years ago before your father, before any of the others we found in that strongbox. He was the first, I think. The one Caldwell practiced on. Clara stared at him. Daniel, she said. The name felt strange in her mouth. She had met her uncle twice, maybe 3 times when she was very young. He and her father had argued she had never known exactly what about, and then he was simply not there anymore, and her father had never talked about him, and she had eventually stopped asking. He didn't know what had happened to your father, Ethan said. He left Red Hollow before Thomas died, but he knew about Caldwell. He'd been trying to find someone who would listen for 9 years. He paused. When I told him I was coming here, he asked me. He stopped. What? Clara said. He asked me to find his niece. Ethan looked at her directly. He said there's a girl running her father's saloon, and she's been doing it alone, and I've been carrying the guilt of leaving her there for 9 years. He asked me to find out if she was all right. The cold at elevation was very complete. Clara sat with that for a moment. Her uncle. 9 years of guilt she hadn't known existed attached to a name her father had not spoken. And a man who had ridden into Red Hollow 3 days ago, claiming to be passing through slowly, who had actually come specifically to find her. "You came here for me," she said. "I came here because Caldwell needed to be stopped," Ethan said carefully. "I stayed because of what I found when I got here." She looked at him. "That's a very precise distinction," she said. "I'm a precise person." She was quiet for a moment. "Is Daniel well?" she said. "He's in Billings. He has a small house and a horse trading operation, and he drinks a little more than is good for him, but he's well." Ethan paused. "He'll want to know how this ends." "Tell him his niece is fine," Clara said. "Tell him she's been fine." She thought about it. "Tell him we can talk about the rest when this is over." Ethan nodded. They rode down from the pass as the afternoon turned toward evening, and the descent was easier on the horses, if not on the riders. And by the time the high pass trail met the northern approach to the Helena Road, they had not seen Caldwell's men, and the road ahead was clear. "We're ahead of them," Margaret said. She said it with the satisfaction of a woman who has been navigating Montana terrain for 4 decades and is entitled to some satisfaction. "They'd have to ride through the night to cut us off now." "Don't say it too loud," Hector said. "Montana's listening." They made camp off the road that night. A cold camp, no fire, which was Margaret's decision, and which nobody argued with because Margaret's decisions about the territory had a practical authority that nobody in their right mind would challenge. They ate cold food and wrapped in their blankets, and in the morning they rode. Helena appeared on the afternoon of the second day. The territorial capital was larger than Red Hollow, in the way that all capitals are larger, not just in size, but in a quality of permanence and institution, the feeling of a place that understood itself to be important. Clara had been to Helena twice in her life, both times with her father when she was young, and the feeling of it came back to her now, the sense of a larger world, a world with offices and courts and processes that could, if properly approached, apply force to problems that small-town power structures could not or would not touch. The Territorial Commissioner's office was in a stone building on the main street. Clara walked in with the documents under her arm and Ethan beside her and Margaret and Hector behind her, and she asked to see the commissioner. The clerk at the front desk, a middle-aged man with the faintly defensive posture of someone accustomed to managing people who thought their business was more urgent than it was, looked at her with the particular brand of polite dismissal reserved for women who appeared without appointments. "The commissioner is unavailable today," he said. "If you'd like to leave your name—" "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "My father was Thomas Whitmore of Red Hollow, Montana. I have in my possession original documents demonstrating a systematic fraud operation conducted over at least a decade by Victor Caldwell of Red Hollow, affecting no fewer than 7 families involving altered land agreements, false debt structures, and the active corruption of local law enforcement." She placed the documents on his desk, not slamming them, setting them down carefully, the way you set down something important. "And I have ridden 2 days through the high pass in October to bring them here, so I would very much appreciate it if you could make the commissioner available." The clerk looked in the documents. He looked at Clara's face. He looked at Ethan standing slightly behind her, with the expression of a man who has been a bounty hunter and is very comfortable waiting. He looked at Hector, who was very large. He looked at Margaret, who looked back at him with 71 years of patience and the clear willingness to stand in this office until someone important appeared. "One moment," the clerk said. He was back in under 2 minutes. "Commissioner Aldridge will see you," he said. Commissioner William Aldridge was 60 years old, gray-haired, and had the particular exhausted competence of a man who had spent 30 years in territorial government dealing with problems that ranged from the complicated to the catastrophic, and had developed a calibrated response to each. He looked at Clara when she walked in, and then he looked at the documents she put on his desk, and then he put on his reading glasses and started reading, and the room got very quiet. He read for 12 minutes. Nobody spoke. Then he took off his glasses and looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "how many families are we talking about?" "7 that I've confirmed," she said. Possibly more. And you retrieved these from Caldwell's private strongbox? Yes. Last night? Yes. He looked at Ethan. And you are? Ethan Blackwood, former Deputy U.S. Marshal Billings Office. Aldridge's eyes sharpened slightly. Former. I resigned 2 years ago over a different matter. I can provide references from Commissioner Hayes and Billings if needed. A pause. I can also provide a complete account of the methodology Caldwell used, the timeline I've reconstructed, and the names of witnesses in Red Hollow who are prepared to testify. Aldridge looked at the documents again. He was quiet for a long moment. Victor Caldwell, he said, has been a registered land agent in this territory for 14 years. He has no formal complaints on record. No, Clara said. He doesn't. Because the people he targeted had no one to bring complaints to. Aldridge looked at her. Until now, she said. The commissioner sat back in his chair. He picked up one of the documents, her father's original agreement, and looked at it for a long time. The alteration is not subtle, he said. It's subtle enough to miss if you're not looking for it, but once you know it's there, it's clear. He set it down. Miss Whitmore, is Victor Caldwell currently in Red Hollow? As far as I know, she said. Yes. Aldridge looked at his clerk, who had stationed himself in the doorway. Get me Marshal Patterson, he said. Now. The clerk left. Clara stood in the commissioner's office and let out a breath she had been holding. It felt like for 3 years. The documents were on his desk. The right person was reading them. The process, the legitimate, irresistible process of territorial law, was now in motion. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder. Not a dramatic gesture. Barely a touch. Just a brief, solid presence there, and gone. She did not acknowledge it out loud. She didn't need to. Marshal Patterson arrived in 30 minutes. A lean man of 50, with the economy of movement that came from spending years doing work that required quick decisions in tight spaces. He sat across from Aldridge, read the documents with the speed of a man who knew what he was looking for, and asked Clara 4 precise questions, all of which she answered with equal precision. And then he looked at Aldridge. I can have men in Red Hollow by tomorrow morning, he said. Then have men in Red Hollow by tomorrow morning, Aldridge said. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. We need to be there before them, she said. I know, he said. There are people in Red Hollow who don't know what's coming. Ruth Castle. The Donovan brothers. Everyone Luis and Petey were supposed to gather. I know. They deserve to hear it from someone they know before a marshal rides into town. Clara. His voice was quiet and direct. I know. We leave tonight. She nodded. Then she turned back to Commissioner Aldridge. Commissioner, she said, I need your assurance that when Marshal Patterson's men arrive in Red Hollow, Sheriff Breaker is taken into custody before he has the opportunity to warn Caldwell or destroy any remaining evidence. Aldridge looked at her. You've done this before, he said. No, she said, but I've been planning it for 3 years. Aldridge's expression shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, but the recognition of something he didn't expect. You have my assurance, Miss Whitmore, he said. They left Helena as the sun was going down. 4 people and 3 horses heading back toward the high pass in the last light, and Clara rode with the particular feeling of someone who has put a thing in motion that is larger than themselves and must now trust that the motion carries. She had the originals. Aldridge had copies. Patterson had his orders. And somewhere behind them, riding to meet them in Red Hollow, was the machinery of justice that Caldwell had believed he had successfully insulated himself from. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about a lot of things. How are you? Ethan said, riding beside her in the dimming light. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me when it's over. I will, he said. They rode into the dark together, and the mountains were enormous around them, and Clara Whitmore held herself straight in the saddle and thought about tomorrow, and did not look back once. Show more. They rode through the night. Not fast. The The high pass didn't allow fast, and the horses had already given 2 days of hard work and needed managing. But they rode steady the way people ride when they understand that stopping is not an option, when the thing behind them and the thing ahead of them are both more important than the cold or the dark or the ache that sets into your back and hips after hours in the saddle. Margaret set the pace again. Nobody argued. Clara rode with her mind doing what it had always done under pressure. Running calculations, mapping contingencies, working through the variables of a situation, the way her father had taught her to work through numbers. Marshal Patterson would reach Red Hollow tomorrow morning. That meant Caldwell had tonight. A man like Caldwell, intelligent and methodical and accustomed to managing threats before they fully developed, would use tonight. The question was, how? "He'll run," Hector said from behind her, as if he'd been following the same thread. "When he figures out the commissioner's office has the copies, he'll know it's finished. Men like that, they don't fight when fighting won't save them. They run." "He doesn't know we went to Helena," Margaret said. "His men went south to cut off the main road. He thinks we're still between here and the capital." "He'll figure it out," Ethan said. "Maybe not tonight, but by morning." "Then we need to be there before morning," Clara said. "We will be," Ethan said. "We'll come down off the pass around 2. Red Hollow is another hour and a half at this pace." Clara did the arithmetic. 3:30, maybe 4 in the morning. Patterson and his men wouldn't arrive until dawn at the earliest, more likely mid-morning. That left a window, a gap between their return and the law's arrival, and in that window anything could happen. She thought about Luis and Petey and Ruth and whoever else had been quietly gathered at her instruction. She thought about the silver moon sitting dark on the main street. She thought about Victor Caldwell in his large house at the north end of town. A man who had spent 14 years building a system of control so thorough that he had simply assumed it was permanent, now sitting with the knowledge that his strongbox had been opened and his originals were gone. "What would a man like that do with a night, Ethan?" she said. "I'm thinking the same thing," he said. "Tell me." "He won't run yet, not until he knows for certain that Helena has been contacted. Right now he still thinks there's a chance we're just hiding somewhere with the documents waiting to use them locally to go to Breaker or Henley, which would give him room to manage. He won't run until he's certain there's nowhere to manage to." A pause. "But he'll move against the people he thinks are involved. Tonight, before dawn." Clara's hands tightened on the reins. "Ruth," she said, "and Hector's forge, and anyone Caldwell suspects of helping." Ethan's voice was controlled, but the edge in it was real. "He can't undo what's been taken, but he can try to eliminate the witnesses before the law arrives." The mountain air was very cold and very quiet around them. "We ride faster," Clara said. "The horses." "We ride faster," she said again. Hector made a sound of agreement. Margaret didn't argue. They rode faster. Coming down off the pass, the trail opened up and the horses found their footing, and the pace increased until it was something that could almost be called urgent without being reckless. And Clara bent low and held on, and thought about Ruth Castle in her clean house with her straight curtains, and her 7 years of carrying a debt that was never hers to carry. And she rode like the distance between herself and that house was something she could close through sheer will. They reached the valley floor at 2:15. Red Hollow was dark and quiet, the way small towns are at this hour. The particular quiet that is not peaceful, but simply the absence of the noise people make when they are awake, a quiet with weight to it, a quiet that can hide things. Clara pulled her horse to a stop at the edge of town. "We split," Ethan said low. He had pulled up beside her. "I go to Caldwell's house. If he's moving tonight, it starts from there. Hector Ruth Castle's house. Margaret." "The Silver Moon," Margaret said. "If people have been gathering there, they need someone who knows what's happened." "Clara." "I go with you," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "Clara, those are my people he's moving against," she said. "And you might need someone who knows this town and these people better than you do." She held his gaze. "I go with you." A beat. "All right," he said. They left the horses with Margaret and went on foot, staying off the main street, using the back route that Clara knew from years of early mornings and late nights moving through this town before anyone else was awake. She knew which dog would bark and which wouldn't, which gate hinges needed lifting to open silently, which stretch of ground was soft enough to muffle footsteps. Ethan followed her lead without comment. That she thought was something she had not encountered before in a man, the willingness to follow without qualifying it, without managing it, without making it into something he was allowing, rather than something that simply made sense. Caldwell's house was lit. Not all of it 2 windows, the ones at the front, which meant the parlor and possibly the study. At this hour, that meant either he couldn't sleep or he was doing something he needed to be awake for. They stopped in the shadow at the side of the house and listened. Voices. Inside. Low enough that the words weren't clear, but the tone was the clipped, directive tone of a man giving instructions. "He's talking to someone," Clara breathed. Ethan nodded. He moved toward the side window, the one that faced the neighbor's fence rather than the street, and she followed, and they stood pressed against the wall and listened, and now the words were clear enough. The forge first, Caldwell's voice, controlled. The voice of a man who was afraid, but was not going to let fear change his pace. "Ruiz has been talking. If we put enough pressure on the forge operation, he'll have other things to worry about then." "What about the Whitmore woman?" Another voice. One of the men from the meeting, Clara thought the stranger's voice, the one with the specific purpose and no paper trail. "She's not in Red Hollow," Caldwell said. "If she was, she'd have moved by now. She's somewhere between here and Helena, and she can stay there. By the time she gets back with whatever she thinks she has, this will be managed." A pause. "What if she already got there?" the stranger's voice said. Silence. When Caldwell spoke again, something in his voice had changed quality, a fracture in the control, barely perceptible, but real. "She couldn't have. The South Road." "She didn't take the South Road," the stranger said. "Your men on the South Road haven't seen her, haven't seen anyone. Which means if she left 2 nights ago, she either went to ground somewhere, or she went another way." Silence. Longer this time. "The High Pass," Caldwell said. The words came out flat like something deflating. "Margaret Phelps. She knows the High Pass." Clara felt Ethan go still beside her. "If she's already been to Helena," the stranger started. "Then we have less time than I thought," Caldwell said. His voice was different now. The control was still there, but it was a different kind of control, the kind that comes from a decision being made, a final calculation being completed. "Change of plan. Forget the forge. Get the horses. We leave in an hour." Clara looked at Ethan. He was already moving. She caught his arm. "If he runs..." "He won't get far," Ethan said. "But I need to slow him down. Stay here." "Ethan!" Clara. His voice was low and absolutely certain. "Stay here. Watch the front door. If anyone comes out before I get back, you get to the Silver Moon, and you get Margaret and whoever else is there, and you make enough noise that the whole town wakes up. Can you do that?" She wanted to argue. She didn't, because he was right. "Yes," she said. He was gone. Clara pressed herself against the wall of Caldwell's house and listened to the voices inside, and watched the front door and breathed slowly through the cold, and thought about what it meant to trust someone enough to stay when everything in her wanted to move. She had not trusted many people in her life. She thought she was probably learning to do it differently. 3 minutes passed. 4. Inside, the voices continued practical, logistical. The voices of men organizing a departure, which meant horses and bags and money and documents and all the material necessities of a man dismantling 14 years of built position in under an hour. Clara listened and counted minutes and watched the door. Then she heard it. Not from inside. From the side of the house, a sharp sound, something between a scuffle and a collision brief, and then quiet. Then Ethan's voice low and controlled. "Don't." Then nothing. Clara moved. She went around the side of the house fast and silent, and found Ethan with his forearm across the chest of the man she didn't know, the stranger. The one with the specific purpose, pressing him against the wall, with the compact efficiency of someone who knows exactly how much force is enough and has never needed to use more. The man was not small. He was trying anyway. "Stop," Ethan said. Not loudly. Just with the quality of someone who says a thing and means it in a way that registers in the body before it registers in the mind. The man stopped trying. "He was heading for the stable," Ethan said to Clara, not taking his eyes off the man. "Getting the horses early." Clara looked at the man. He looked back at her with the particular expression of a man who has been caught doing something he was confident he wouldn't be caught doing, and who is now recalculating his options very rapidly. "What's your name?" she said. He said nothing. "All right," she said. "Here's what you need to understand. By tomorrow morning, there will be territorial marshals in this town with copies of every document that was in Victor Caldwell's strongbox. The commissioner's office in Helena has seen them. There are 7 families whose names are on those documents who will testify. And you," she looked at him steadily, "are currently a man with a specific purpose and no paper trail standing outside the house of a man who is going to prison. Which means your choices right now are limited to how this goes for you specifically." The man looked at her. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he said, "My name is Frank Delray. I ride for Caldwell's Eastern operation." "What's the Eastern operation?" Ethan said. "Land transactions. Helena mostly. Some in Bozeman." He paused. "I've been carrying documents between Caldwell and a man in the Helena Land Registry for 3 years. Clara went very still. "A man in the Helena Land Registry," she said. "Not the commissioner's office." "No, the sub-registry. Land record certification." Delray's voice was flat, the voice of a man who has decided that the math of his situation points in one direction. "Caldwell doesn't just alter copies here. He gets the alterations certified through a clerk in Helena who validates them as originals. It makes the copies look legitimate if anyone checks against the territorial record." The cold felt different suddenly, more complete. "That means," Clara started. "The documents you have," Ethan said. He looked at her. "The originals from the strongbox. If Caldwell has a certified version of his altered copies in the territorial record, then when Patterson's men arrive, Caldwell shows them the certified copies," Clara said, "and claims our documents are the forgeries." The silence was very loud. "We need to get back to Helena," Ethan said. "We just came from Helena." "I know." Clara pressed her hand against her coat, against the documents beneath it. The originals. The actual truth in her father's actual handwriting, with the actual number he had actually agreed to. She thought about Commissioner Aldridge reading them. She thought about him saying, "The alteration is not subtle, but once you know it's there, it's clear." She thought about the certified copies in the sub-registry, the ones designed to make Caldwell's version look like the institutional record. "Who is the clerk?" she asked Delray. "In the sub-registry." "Man named Corbin, Gerald Corbin." "Does Aldridge know him?" Delray hesitated. "Does Aldridge know Corbin?" Clara said again. "Corbin's been in that office for 12 years, Delray said. "Aldridge knows everyone in that office." "Then we don't need to go back to Helena," she said. Ethan looked at her. "We send a message," she said. "Tonight. We send a rider to Helena with a written account of what Delray just told us. Corbin's named the sub-registry, the certification scheme. Aldridge already has our documents. If he knows to look at Corbin, he can compare the certifications against the originals himself. He doesn't need us there." She was thinking fast, building it as she spoke, and she could feel Ethan following the logic, and she could feel the moment he arrived at the same conclusion she had. "Who do we send?" he said. "P.D. Walsh," she said. "He's young, and he's fast, and he knows what's at stake. And he made copies of documents for Caldwell for 8 months. He can describe exactly what Corbin's certifications looked like, which gives Aldridge something specific to pull." Ethan was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes?" he said. "All right." Clara looked at Delray. "You're going to write down what you just told me. Your name, Corbin's name, the arrangement, the timeline, all of it." She looked at Ethan. "And then he's going to be somewhere secure until Patterson arrives." "The forge," Ethan said. Hector's place. The forge, she agreed. Frank Delray, who had presumably spent his career being the kind of man who made problems disappear for other people, and had never expected to find himself on this side of the arrangement, looked at Clara Whitmore, standing in the cold dark outside his employer's house, with the quiet certainty of someone who has run out of patience and run into purpose, and he said, "All right." Inside the house, Victor Caldwell was still talking. He didn't know yet that his exit had been removed. The next 40 minutes were the most precisely organized 40 minutes of Clara's life, and she had organized a lot of things in a lot of difficult circumstances. Ethan took Delray to Hector's forge, which turned out to be where Hector already was, having arrived 20 minutes earlier, and found Luis and Ruth and 4 other people who had gathered there instead of the Silver Moon because the forge was more defensible, and Hector had made that determination himself without being asked, which told Clara something about Hector Ruiz that she already knew and was glad to have confirmed. Ruth looked at Clara the moment she came through the forge door. "You're back," Ruth said. "I'm back. Helena. Done. Or it will be by morning." Clara crossed to her, took her hands. "Are you all right?" Ruth stopped. Her hands were cold. Her face had the drawn quality of someone who had been holding a particular kind of tension for an extended period and was not quite ready to release it yet, because releasing it too early had its own risks. "I've been better," she said honestly. "But I've been worse. Much worse." "I know," Clara said. "It's almost over." "Almost," Ruth said. "Almost is close enough to work with," Clara said. She found Petey Walsh in the corner of the forge, sitting on an overturned bucket with his elbows on his knees, looking like a young man who had been awake for a very long time doing things he hadn't expected to be doing at 17. "Petey," she said, "I need you to ride to Helena." He looked up. She told him what she needed. Corbin's name, the sub-registry, the written account that Delray was currently producing at Hector's workbench, with the focused cooperation of a man who had decided which way the math pointed. She told him that Commissioner Aldridge already had the originals and knew what he was looking at, and that what he needed now was the name of the man in the sub-registry, and someone who could describe exactly what the certified copies looked like. Petey listened. He was young and tired, and had been carrying guilt for months, and had ridden very hard in the last 24 hours, and had clearly not slept, and when Clara finished, he straightened up on his overturned bucket and said, "When do I leave Boom?" "Now," she said. "As soon as Delray finishes writing. I'll take the South Road. It's faster." "Caldwell's men are on the South Road." "Caldwell's men have been sitting on the South Road since yesterday morning waiting for someone who wasn't coming," Petey said. "They'll be half asleep and bored, and they won't be looking for a 17-year-old boy on a fast horse at 3 in the morning." He looked at her steadily. "I can get through." Clara looked at him. She thought about what it was to be 17 and make a decision like that with clear eyes. "Be careful," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Delray's written account was done in 12 minutes. Petey read it through once, asked 2 precise questions, and folded it into his coat. He shook Ethan's hand, nodded at Hector, and looked at Clara one more time. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm sorry I didn't—" "Petey." She stopped him gently. "Go." He went. Now there was the other thing. Caldwell was still in his house preparing to run, unaware that his exit route had been neutralized and that his certified copies in Helena were about to become the evidence against him rather than for him. He would figure it out. Eventually, men like Caldwell always figured it out, but right now he didn't know. "We could wait for Patterson," Ethan said. "He said it the way you offer an option you know won't be taken just to make sure it's on the table." "By the time Patterson arrives, Caldwell might be gone," Clara said. "He won't get far. That's not the point." She looked around the forge at Ruth and the Donovan brothers and Margaret, who had appeared at some point with the horses, and installed herself near the door with the calm authority of someone who has decided she is staying, and old Ben Haverford, who had lost a grazing claim 3 years ago, and had the specific anger of a man who had swallowed it quietly for too long. "These people have been waiting, some of them for years. They deserve to be there when it ends. Ethan looked at the room. He looked back at her. "All right," he said. "But we do this carefully. No mob, no guns, nothing that gives Caldwell's lawyers something to work with in a courtroom." "Agreed," she said. "We walk up to his front door and we knock." A beat. "And then," Hector said. "And then we tell him it's over," Clara said. "And we let him make his choices in front of witnesses." They walked to Caldwell's house in a group, not a crowd, not a mob, but a deliberate and particular gathering of people who had been individually diminished by the same man and who had chosen on this specific night to be diminished no longer. Clara at the front, Ethan beside her, Hector on her other side, Ruth and Margaret behind them, the Donovan brothers, Ben Haverford, and others who had come out of houses as they walked, drawn by the sight of this movement through the pre-dawn dark, standing in doorways in their nightclothes, and then something in the quality of the gathering communicating itself without words following. Clara knocked on Caldwell's door. Not pounded. Knocked. 4 deliberate strikes, the knock of someone who is not afraid of the answer. Silence from inside. She knocked again. The door opened. Victor Caldwell stood in the doorway in his traveling clothes he had packed. Then he had been ready to go, and looked out at the collection of people assembled in front of his house in the cold hours before dawn, and for the first time in 14 years of operating in Red Hollow as the most powerful man in the valley. His face showed something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of something he had not planned for. He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was very controlled. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He looked past her at the faces. He found Hector. He found Ruth. He found the Donovan brothers. He found old Ben Haverford. And the others, the ones who had come out of their houses to follow the people of Red Hollow, who had watched this man operate for a decade, and told themselves they couldn't do anything, and had now at 4 a.m, on the basis of a woman's knock on a door, decided that they could. "I don't know what you think you have," Caldwell said. "Your originals," Clara said. 14 years of them. The commissioner's office in Helena has copies. Marshal Patterson will be here by mid-morning." She paused. "And the clerk in the sub-registry who certified your altered documents is being looked at right now by the same commissioner." Something happened in Caldwell's face. It was not a large movement, just a settling the way a structure settles when the thing that was holding it up is removed. His jaw, the set of his mouth, the quality of his eyes, he knew. "I also know," Clara said, "that you altered my father's agreement before the ink was dry on his signature. I know that my father spent 8 years paying you money he didn't owe, and that I've spent 3 more years doing the same, and that the property my father built from nothing is still sitting in your land record under your name because you changed a single digit in a document and trusted that nobody would look closely enough to see it." She held his gaze. He looked closely. At 2 a.m, with a lamp burning down to nothing, he looked closely. And he knew. He just didn't have anyone willing to stand with him. Caldwell said nothing. "I have 7 signed statements from families you did this to," Clara continued. "I have your original documents. I have a witness to your sub-registry arrangement. And I have a room full of people who are done staying quiet." She looked at him steadily. "So I'm going to ask you to step back inside your house and wait for the marshal. And I'm going to ask that as one person talking to another in front of witnesses, so that whatever choice you make is made clearly and on the record." The crowd behind her was very still. Caldwell stood in his doorway. He looked at Clara Whitmore, the saloon girl, the woman who poured drinks for men who laughed at her. The woman everyone in Red Hollow had filed into a particular drawer, marked harmless and permanent, and going nowhere, and he did something she did not expect. He stepped back. "I'll wait," he said. He said it quietly without drama, the way a man speaks when he has made the only calculation left available to him. He stepped back from the door. Clara turned to face the people behind her. They were looking at her. Not at Caldwell's house, not at each other, but at her. Ruth with her red-rimmed eyes and her straight spine. Hector with his massive arms crossed and something on his face that was not triumph exactly, but was the thing that comes just before it. The Donovan brothers. Ben Haverford. The neighbors who had come out of their houses and followed through the dark because something in this gathering had communicated itself as important in a way that didn't need words. And Ethan, standing slightly behind and to the right, exactly where he always positioned himself, not in front, not the center, but present, watchful, the steady point that she had begun to navigate by without quite realizing she was doing it. He looked at her. In his face was the thing she had first seen 3 days ago in a saloon corner. The look that was not pity, not performance, but simply the recognition of someone worth looking at. It hadn't changed. All of this, and it hadn't changed. She turned back to face the town. "Go home," she said to the people who had come out of their houses in their night clothes. "Get some sleep. The marshal will be here by mid-morning, and when he is, anyone who has a statement to make should come forward. But right now—" She looked at the sky, which was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of what would eventually be dawn. "It's 4 in the morning and it's cold, and everything that needed to happen tonight has happened." People started moving. Slowly at first, then, with the purposeful ease of people who have been holding something difficult and have put it down and can move freely again. They went back toward their houses, some of them touching Clara's arm as they passed. Some of them saying things she mostly didn't catch, some of them just nodding with the particular weighted nod that means more than the gesture itself. Ruth stopped in front of her. She looked at Clara for a long moment. "Your father would have been so proud of you," she said. It hit Clara in a way she wasn't prepared for, which she should have anticipated, but somehow hadn't, and she had to do the thing she had been doing all night, all 3 years, and breathe through it instead of into it. "He would have been relieved," she said when she could. "He always hated loose ends." Ruth laughed a real laugh, brief and surprised, and full of feeling, and then she pulled Clara into a hug that was short and fierce, and said everything that needed to be said. And then she let go and walked home. Clara stood on Caldwell Street in the pre-dawn dark with the documents against her ribs and the cold in her bones, and 3 years of relentless forward motion, finally for the first time decelerating into something she could feel rather than just endure. Ethan stood beside her. "You're shaking," he said. "I know." She wasn't cold exactly, or she was, but that wasn't why. "I'll stop." "Take your time." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to Red Hollow." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for letting me," he said. She looked away at the street, at the town beginning its slow, barely there movement toward morning. "What happens now?" she said. "Practically. The marshal, the trial. Aldridge will move fast. He has to territorial land fraud at this scale is a serious case, and he knows it." Ethan's voice was even practical. "The trial will most likely be in Helena. You'll be called to testify. So will Ruth Hector, the Donovan brothers, Ben P.D. Walsh." He paused. "And me." "And Caldwell. He'll have lawyers. Good ones, he has the money. But the documents are clear and the witnesses are credible. And he confessed nothing tonight that can be used against him, which was smart, but the evidence doesn't need his confession." A pause. "He's going to prison, Clara." She let that land. She had known it in the abstract since Helena. But abstract knowledge and standing in front of a man's house at 4 in the morning after 3 years of his debt and her silence and 1 week of finally moving, those were different things, and the difference was something she needed to let herself feel. "And the land," she said. "The territorial commissioner has authority to reverse fraudulent land transfers. It won't be fast, it'll take months probably, legal process is never fast, but the original agreements establish clear prior claim. Your father's property, the Casanova grazing rights, the Donovan parcels." He was careful and accurate the way he always was when precision mattered. "It comes back." The Silver Moon Saloon sat down the street dark and waiting. Her father had built it with borrowed money, and 30 years of stubborn optimism, and the belief that a man who recorded things honestly would always know the truth of where he stood. He had been right. He had just needed someone willing to stand with him. "Ethan?" she said. "Yes." "What were you going to do after this? When you'd done what you came here to do?" He was quiet. "I hadn't planned that far," he said. She looked at him. "That seems like something worth planning," she said. In his face, something shifted. Not the measuring look, not the watchful stillness, but something underneath both of those. Something that had been there since the beginning, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to be visible. "It might be," he said. Dawn was beginning to come. Not sunrise, not yet, but the first honest suggestion of it. The gray becoming slightly less dark. The shapes of the town beginning to resolve out of shadow into themselves. Clara Whitmore stood in it and felt the cold, and felt the exhaustion, and felt underneath both of those something she had not felt in a very long time. Something so unfamiliar, she had to sit with it for a moment before she could identify it. She felt light. Not happy. Happiness was specific and came later. This was something prior to happiness. The feeling of a weight that has been part of the landscape for so long, you stopped noticing it, and then one day it's gone, and the absence of it is so complete and so physical that you stand still for a moment just to feel the shape of the air where it used to be. 3 years. 11 years of her father's. And now this morning, on a cold street in Red Hollow, Montana, with a territorial marshal riding hard from Helena, and a man beside her who had come looking for his lost friend's niece and stayed for something neither of them had named. Yet it was over. Almost. Almost was close enough to work with. She turned toward the silver moon. "Coffee," she said. "Lord, yes," said Margaret, from behind them, which was how Clara discovered that Margaret Phelps had been standing 15 feet back the entire time, having installed herself there, sometime during the conversation, in the manner of a woman who has been on this earth long enough to know when to stand back, and when to stand close, and has never once gotten the two confused. Clara almost laughed. She did laugh, a real one, short and warm, and entirely genuine, the first one in so long it felt like finding something she'd put down and forgotten. She walked toward the silver moon. And for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel like she was walking alone. The coffee was hot and the silver moon was warm, and for a little while in the hour before dawn, it was just the four of them. Clara and Ethan and Margaret and Hector, sitting at the bar in the place her father had built, drinking from cups that Clara filled without measuring, because measuring wasn't what this moment needed. Nobody talked much. That was all right. Some situations had been talked through completely, and what remained on the other side of the talking was something quieter and more solid, something that didn't require words to maintain itself. They sat with their coffee and the warmth of the stove and the particular quality of silence that belongs to people who have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side still intact, and that was enough. Hector left first because the forge opened early, and he had a young man locked inside it with a written confession and a territorial marshal arriving in a matter of hours, and those were things that required his attention. He put his cup down and looked at Clara for a moment, the way he had looked at her in the alley behind his forge 2 nights ago, with that respectful gravity that big men sometimes have, and said, "Your father would have fought alongside you." Clara nodded. "I know," she said. He left. Margaret stayed another 20 minutes drinking her coffee with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had been up for 22 hours and intended to enjoy the parts that were enjoyable before she went home to sleep. When she finally stood, she put a hand briefly on Clara's shoulder, just rested it there, warm and solid, for about 3 seconds. And then she picked up her coat and walked out into the early gray of the morning without ceremony, which was exactly how Margaret Phelps did everything. Then it was just the two of them. Clara refilled Ethan's cup without asking. He accepted it without asking. She went around to the customer side of the bar and sat on the stool nearest to him, because standing behind the bar right now felt like a role she had been playing for 3 years, and she wanted for 5 minutes to sit somewhere else. He looked at her. She looked at her coffee. "Tell me about your uncle," she said, not because she needed to fill the silence, because she had been carrying the information about Daniel Whitmore since the high pass, and she had set it aside to deal with more urgent things, and now it was here again, sitting in the room with them, and she was ready to look at it. Ethan told her. Daniel Whitmore was 57 years old and had lived in Billings for 9 years, since the year Caldwell had taken his land claim. And he had made the calculation, the painful, humiliating, survival-based calculation that Clara understood completely, that leaving was the only viable option. He ran a small horse trading operation out of a stable on the north end of town. He had 2 dogs he was very attached to, and a habit of reading the territorial newspapers cover to cover, looking for Caldwell's name, which he had never found, which had eaten at him for 9 years, in the specific way that injustice eats at people who know exactly what was done to them and can't prove it. He had told Ethan about Red Hollow the way a man talks about a wound that never healed properly, with a controlled, careful quality that was the surface of something much larger underneath. He had told him about Thomas, his brother, whom he had argued with the year before he left, over a business disagreement that had seemed important at the time, and which he would, he said, regret for the rest of his life. He had told him about a niece he had met twice when she was young, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and who was, as far as he knew, still in Red Hollow running a saloon and paying a debt she couldn't explain. He had asked Ethan to find her, and then Ethan had said quietly, "He cried when he told me. He's not a man who cries easily." I don't think he'd cried about it in 9 years, which meant it had just been sitting there, and when he started talking about it, it all came out at once. Clara sat with that. "I was angry at him," she said. "After my father died. I didn't even know exactly why we barely knew each other, but he just wasn't there. And the town wasn't there, and I told myself I didn't need any of them, and I meant it, but wanting something and needing it are different things, and I was never very good at admitting the difference." "Most people aren't," Ethan said. "He left because he had to," she said. "Yes. The same way I stayed because I had to." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to write to him," she said. "When this is settled, I want him to know what happened." "He'll want to know," Ethan said. "Will you—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "Will you still be here when this is settled?" The question sat between them. Ethan looked at his coffee cup. She watched him do the thing he always did, before he said something true, that brief internal gathering the space he gave himself to arrive at precision. "I've been moving for 2 years," he said. "Town to town, doing what I can and then moving on because there was nothing in any of those towns that made me want to stop." He looked up at her. "I don't feel that way about this one." Clara met his eyes. She thought about the first night he had walked into the Silver Moon and sat in the corner with cold coffee and watchful eyes. She thought about That's Enough in a room full of laughing men. She thought about a ledger spread between them at midnight and a man who had told her the whole truth when half of it would have been easier. She thought about riding through the dark on a mountain trail and a hand on her shoulder that was there and gone in 3 seconds, but had stayed with her longer than that. She thought about all the ways she had learned to be sufficient unto herself, the habits of independence that years of aloneness had made into a kind of armor, and how it felt unexpectedly to find that the armor had a door. "I'm not an easy person to know," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "I'm set in my ways. I run this place the way I run it, and I don't take suggestions well, and I don't ask for help naturally, and I overthink things at 2 in the morning, and I have strong opinions about ledger organization." "I'm aware of all of those things too," he said. "And you're still Clara." He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her from the beginning, not through her, not past her, at her. "Yes, I'm still." The first real light of morning came through the windows of the Silver Moon Saloon. Then the pale, clear light of a Montana dawn, hitting the worn wooden floor, and the bottles on the shelf behind the bar, and the 2 cups of coffee on the counter, and Clara Whitmore sat in it and let herself be seen. The marshal arrived at 9:30. His name was Patterson, and he had the same lean efficiency. She had registered in the commissioner's office in Helena, and he came with 4 deputies and a written order from Commissioner Aldridge that covered the arrest of Victor Caldwell, the detention of Sheriff Breaker, pending investigation of corruption charges, and the preservation of all remaining documents in the land registry building. Clara met him at the edge of town. She had slept for 3 hours on the narrow cot behind the bar, which was not enough, and was also more than she'd managed in 2 days, and she had washed her face and changed her dress and pinned her hair with the particular efficiency of a woman who has learned that how you present yourself in important moments is not vanity, but communication. Patterson looked at her with the assessing look of a professional who is sizing up a witness. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Marshall," she said. "I'll take you to Caldwell." Caldwell was where she had left him in his house, not having run, which was either calculation or resignation, or some mixture of both. He came to the door when Patterson knocked, and he looked at the badge and the 4 deputies, and then he looked past them at Clara, and whatever he saw in her face told him something that the badge and the deputies had merely confirmed. "Victor Caldwell," Patterson said, "you are under arrest by order of the Territorial Commissioner on charges of fraud, forgery, falsification of land records, and corruption of a public official. You have the right to legal representation, which will be arranged in Helena." Caldwell said nothing. He put on his coat, and he walked out of his house between 2 deputies, and he did not look at Clara again, and Clara watched him go with a feeling she had difficulty naming precisely, not triumph, not relief, not satisfaction, though all 3 were present in some proportion. Something more fundamental than any of those. The feeling of a door closing on a room she had been locked in for 11 years. It closed. He was gone. 2 deputies went for Sheriff Breaker, who opened his office door in his uniform and his carefully maintained posture of official authority, and looked at the warrant in Patterson's hand, and visibly deflated the authority, leaving him like air from a punctured thing. He did not resist. He said, "I was following orders," and Patterson said, "You can explain that to the commissioner," and the handcuffs went on with the mechanical finality of an ending. Red Hollow watched all of it. The town had a particular quality that morning people in doorways and on the street and at windows present in a way that was different from ordinary curiosity. The quality of a community that has watched something happen to itself and is still in the process of understanding what it means. Some of them had been at Caldwell's house at 4 in the morning. Most of them hadn't, but all of them had been somewhere in the territory of knowing that something was wrong and not saying it, and that knowledge had its own weight, and they were feeling it now with the specificity that comes when the abstract becomes concrete. Ruth Castle stood on her front step and watched Caldwell go past in custody and put one hand over her mouth. Then she lowered it and stood straight. Hector Ruiz came out of the forge and stood in the street with his arms crossed and watched. And when the deputies passed with Caldwell between them, he nodded once, the nod of a man who has waited a long time for a specific thing and is acknowledging its arrival. The Donovan brothers stood together for the first time in what looked like months, without the particular hunched quality of men carrying something too heavy, and one of them said something to the other, and the other one nodded, and they both watched until the marshal's party was out of sight. Old Ben Haverford took off his hat. He held it over his chest and watched Victor Caldwell leave Red Hollow, and he held his hat there until the last deputy disappeared around the corner, and then he put it back on and went inside. And Clara thought about what it meant to be a man in his 70s who had swallowed an injustice for 3 years, and finally hadn't had to swallow it anymore. Patterson came back to the Silver Moon before he left for Helena. He sat at the bar, the same bar where Harvey Dalton had laughed at her, the same bar where Ethan had drunk cold coffee for 3 nights, the same bar where she had spread her father's ledger out at midnight and watched someone look at it with honest attention for the first time. And he went through several practical matters. The timeline for the trial, the procedure for land record reversal, the formal statements that would be needed and when they would need to be given. He was efficient and thorough and treated her with the straightforward professional respect of someone who has assessed a witness and found the assessment favorable. At the end of it, he looked at her for a moment with something beyond the professional. "You know," he said, "in 20 years of this work, I've never seen a fraud case this size come undone because one person looked at a changed number in a ledger." "My father showed me how to look," Clara said. Patterson nodded. "Good man," he said, even though he had never met Thomas Whitmore. "Yes," Clara said. "He was." Patterson left. The trial happened 6 weeks later in Helena, in a courthouse that was large and institutional and smelled of wood polish and official paper, and Clara sat in the witness box in the dress she had brought from Red Hollow. Not her best dress, because what she owned didn't sort neatly into best and regular, but the dress she felt most like herself in, and she told the truth to a courtroom with a clarity and a precision that made the attorney representing Caldwell attempt to rattle her 3 times and fail 3 times, because Clara Whitmore was a woman who had been rattled by real things, and a courtroom with a hostile attorney was not by comparison very rattling. Gerald Corbin, the sub-registry clerk in Helena, had confessed within 12 hours of P.D. Walsh arriving with Del Rey's written account. The confession had been comprehensive: names, dates, amounts, the specific methodology by which altered copies were made to look like authenticated originals. He had, in Patterson's words, talked like a man who had been waiting to confess for years and was relieved to finally be doing it. Frank Del Rey, who had the courtroom instincts of someone who had operated in morally gray territory for long enough to understand the difference between a liability and an asset, had provided testimony of such specific and detailed usefulness that the prosecuting attorney had described him in private as the best accidental witness he'd ever had. P.D. Walsh sat in this witness box with the solemn composure of a young man who had decided who he was going to be and was being it, and described in precise detail the process of making altered copies, the instruction he had been given to match certain figures to certain certified versions, and the dates on which he had done so. And then Clara. Clara sat in the box and put her hands flat on the railing in front of her, and answered every question asked of her, with the level directness she had been practicing for 3 years inside her own head, in the arguments she'd had with herself at 2 a.m. over ledger numbers that wouldn't resolve. When the defense attorney suggested that her reading of the original document was colored by personal grievance, she said, "The number is what it is. Personal grievance doesn't change arithmetic." When he suggested that her father might have agreed to different terms than what the original document showed, she said, "My father taught me to read numbers honestly, and I read these honestly, and they say what they say. You can look at them yourself. The court can look at them. Anyone who looks at them without deciding in advance what they want them to say will see what I saw." When he suggested that the testimony of a saloon owner was of questionable reliability, she said very quietly and very clearly, "I have run a business in Red Hollow, Montana for 3 years. I have managed accounts, tracked transactions, maintained records, and identified a systematic fraud that your client has been running for 14 years. The question of my reliability might be better directed at the record." The courtroom was quiet after that. The judge, who had the particular experienced stillness of someone who has seen a great deal and retains the capacity to be impressed only by specific things, looked at her over his glasses for a moment before continuing. Victor Caldwell was convicted on 11 counts. He received 12 years. He stood in the courtroom and heard the verdict with the face of a man who has spent years operating from the premise that his intelligence and his position made him unreachable, and who is now confronting the information that he was wrong about that, and the confronting of it is happening in public. Clara watched him. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected something like satisfaction, the clean click of justice, arriving where it was supposed to go. What she felt instead was more complicated and more human than that, a deep exhaustion. And underneath the exhaustion, something like grief, not for Caldwell, but for the years, for the time, for her father, who had known something was wrong and never got to see it acknowledged. She felt all of that simultaneously sitting in a Helena courtroom, in the dress she felt most like herself in, and she let herself feel it, because she had learned in the last several weeks that the alternative, putting things in boxes and moving forward and getting through, was only sustainable for so long before the boxes became the problem. Ethan was in the courtroom. He had testified on the 3rd day, giving a clear and methodical account of the investigation from his arrival in Red Hollow to the retrieval of the documents to the identification of the certification scheme, and the prosecuting attorney had clearly been delighted to have a former U.S. Marshal deputy on the stand, and Ethan had given his testimony with the same level plainness he brought to everything. He was sitting in the 2nd row when the verdict came down. He looked at Clara when it did. She looked back at him. And something passed between them that did not require explanation or words or any of the articulations that people use to manage the distance between themselves. Something that was simply recognition. The specific recognition of two people who have been through something together and know it in their bones. She turned back to face the front of the courtroom. 12 years. All right. They took the train back to Red Hollow. It was the first time Clara had ever taken a train. The line had only reached that part of Montana the previous year, and she had never had reason or funds to use it, and the experience was so different from riding through the high pass in the dark that she found it almost funny, the contrast, the plush seat and the window and the landscape moving past at an impossible speed. Ethan sat across from her. Margaret had gone back 3 days earlier because her property didn't manage itself, and she had been away from it long enough. Hector had never come to Helena. He had given his formal statement in Red Hollow to a deputy. Patterson had left behind and had gone back to the forge because the forge was the forge, and things needed making. Ruth had come to Helena and gone home the same day as the verdict because she had cried in the hallway outside the courtroom for a long time, and after that, she had been ready to go home. Clara and Ethan were alone in their section of the car. "What does the land reversal process look like?" she asked. She had asked Patterson and Helena, and she was asking again because she was a person who organized things by understanding them from multiple angles. 6 months probably, Ethan said. Maybe slightly longer. The commissioner's office has to review each claim individually against the original documents, establish prior legal standing, and issue reversal orders through the land registry. He paused. Your father's property is the clearest case. The documentation is complete and unambiguous. The others will take slightly longer, depending on what survived in their original paperwork. The Silver Moon sits on a portion of the original property, she said. I know. When the property reverts, there will be decisions to make about what to do with it. Yes. She looked out the window. The landscape was moving past big and open and brown gold, with late autumn, the kind of landscape that made you understand why people had come here and also why coming here had required a particular kind of stubbornness. I've been thinking, she said, about the Silver Moon, what it should be, what it could be. She turned back from the window. People in Red Hollow need somewhere to be, not to drink or not only to drink, somewhere to sit and think and talk to each other without it costing them anything, somewhere that's actually theirs. She paused. Ruth could use space for some kind of women's cooperative, she mentioned once years ago, and never pursued because there was nowhere to put it. The Donovan brothers need somewhere to hold their grazing rights meetings without paying for a room at the hotel. And there are families coming into the territory who have nobody to tell them how any of this works. The Saloon as community institution, Ethan said. It always was one, she said. Just not a useful one. He looked at her with that expression, not the measuring look, but the one underneath it, the one that had been there from the beginning. You're already planning the next thing, he said. I'm always planning the next thing, she said. That's how I'm built. I know, he said. And the way he said it was not resigned or cautious or managing. It was simply true and simply accepting. She looked at him. Ethan, she said. Yes. I don't know how to do this, she said. Whatever this is. I know how to run a business in difficult circumstances. I know how to read ledgers and manage accounts and keep things moving when everything is trying to stop. I don't know how to... She stopped, started again. I've been alone for a long time, and I think I'm good at it in some ways, and I think those ways are not always good. He was quiet the way he was when he was giving himself space to arrive at something true. I don't know how to do it either, he said. I've been moving for 2 years. Before that, I was working, and the work was the thing, and everything else was what happened around the work. He paused. But I came to Red Hollow, looking for one thing, and found something else, and the something else turned out to matter more than the thing I was looking for. He looked at her steadily. So I'm also figuring it out. That's not exactly reassuring, she said. No, he agreed. But it's honest. She looked at him for a long moment. I can work with honest, she said. I know you can, he said. The train moved through the Montana afternoon, and the landscape opened out, and Clara let herself sit with the feeling of forward motion that was not urgent, not driven by necessity or danger, or the need to outrun something, but simply the ordinary forward motion of a life continuing past the moment when the worst thing stopped. She had not experienced that in a very long time. It felt strange and wide, like stepping from a small room into open air. Red Hollow came to meet them in the early evening, the town appearing first as a line of smoke from chimneys, and then as the shapes of buildings against the darkening sky, and then as itself specific and familiar and entirely altered from what it had been a week ago, not in its physical arrangement, but in some quality that Clara felt rather than saw. The silver moon was lit. She had not lit it. She stepped off the train with Ethan behind her and walked toward the main street. And as she got closer, she could hear noise from inside the saloon. Not the noise of a rough night, not the noise of something requiring intervention, but the noise of people conversation. The particular warm, complicated sound of a room full of human beings being in a room together. She pushed the door open. The room turned. Hector was there taking up a considerable amount of space near the back. The Donovan brothers were at a table with 3 other men she recognized as neighbors from the East Road. Ruth was at the bar with 2 women Clara knew from church, which was interesting because Clara couldn't remember the last time she had seen those women in the silver moon. Ben Haverford was in the corner that had been Ethan's corner, which seemed appropriate. Margaret Phelps was sitting at a center table with a cup of something that was definitely not coffee and an expression of complete self-possession. And there were others, people who had come out of their houses at 4 in the morning and followed through the dark, people whose names Clara knew and whose lives had touched the edges of this story in ways she hadn't fully mapped yet. They were all looking at her. The room was very quiet for one moment. Then Hector said, "Well." His voice was its usual considerable volume, warm, with something he didn't usually put in his voice. "You're back." "I'm back," Clara said. "Caldwell. 12 years. The room moved, not an eruption, not a cheer, but a movement, a collective release of something held for a very long time, a sound that was partly breath and partly voice, and partly just the physical expression of a room full of people letting go of a weight simultaneously. Ruth was crying. She wasn't trying not to. She sat at the bar with tears running down her face and a small, fierce smile, and she didn't wipe her eyes, and Clara crossed to her and stood beside her, and Ruth leaned against her shoulder for a moment, and Clara put her arm around her and held on. "James knew," Ruth said, very quietly, just for Clara. "He always knew," Clara said. "I should have believed him." "You believed him in the end," Clara said. "That's what counts." Ruth straightened, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, picked up her cup and held it steady. "All right," she said. "I'm all right." "I know you are," Clara said. The evening went on, the way evenings in the Silver Moon went, and also differently than any evening in the Silver Moon had ever gone, because there was something in the room that hadn't been there before. Not just relief, not just the specific satisfaction of a particular injustice ending, but something more like the beginning of something, the first evening of a thing that was going to be different from what came before it. People talked. They talked to each other in ways that Clara had not seen in this room openly across tables that had previously belonged to specific factions. Miners with ranch hands, women with men, old families with new arrivals. They talked about the land claims and what the reversal would mean and how long it would take, and what they would do with it when it came back. And those were practical conversations. But underneath the practical, there was something else. The conversation that communities have when they have remembered that they are communities. Clara worked the bar. Not because she had to, because it was hers, and she knew every inch of it, and the familiar movement of it was something that felt tonight like something she had chosen, rather than something she was confined to. Ethan sat at the end of the bar. He had been absorbed at some point in the first hour into a conversation with the Donovan brothers about grazing rotation that had apparently been going on longer than it looked, and he was listening with the focused quality he brought to things that interested him and asking questions that were clearly the right questions, because both brothers were leaning forward in the particular way people lean when they feel genuinely heard. She watched him for a moment. He glanced up as if he felt it. She looked away. She didn't feel the need to hide that she had been watching. She just had other things to do. It was Margaret who said it first, because Margaret Phelps was the kind of woman who said things first. She appeared at the bar sometime after 9, set down her empty cup, and looked at Clara with the direct assessment of someone who has decided she has something to say and is going to say it. "That man," she said, inclining her head very slightly toward the end of the bar, where Ethan was still deep in conversation with the Donovan brothers, "is not passing through." "I know," Clara said. "He's been in Red Hollow for 10 days, and he's already on first-name terms with half the town and knows things about grazing rotation that suggest he's been paying attention to this community with some intention." "Margaret, I'm not telling you anything you don't know," Margaret said. "I'm telling you that I've been watching men in this territory for 40 years, and the ones worth knowing are rare. And when you find one, you don't need to make it more complicated than it is." She picked up her refilled cup. "That's all I have to say on the subject." She went back to her table. Clara stood behind the bar and didn't smile. She smiled. Later, after the room had thinned and the evening had settled into its final comfortable hour, Ethan came back to the bar and Clara poured him coffee. That was actually good coffee this time, which she had begun making properly about 4 days ago, and which represented, she recognized, a small and specific accommodation. "The Donovan brothers want to know if you've ever worked cattle," she said. "A little," he said. "A few years back. They're going to offer you work." "I figured. Will you take it?" He looked at the coffee. "I don't know yet. Depends on other things." "What other things?" He looked up at her. "Whether there's a reason to stay in town," he said, "rather than ride out to the Donovan spread every day." Clara looked back at him with the directness she had brought to everything her entire life. The directness that was not aggression, but simply the refusal to make things harder than they needed to be. "There's a room upstairs," she said. "My father used it as an office. It's been storage for 3 years. It's not comfortable. I've slept in worse." "That's not a recommendation." "No," he said, "but it's honest." She looked at him. "It's not a good room," she said. "I'm aware. And this place is mine," she said. "All of it. The way it runs, the way decisions get made, the way the books are kept. That doesn't change." "I would never suggest it should," he said. "And I'm not—" She paused. Chose precision over deflection. "I'm not good at letting people in. I'm better at keeping things moving. I've managed alone for so long that I sometimes forget it's a choice rather than a condition." He looked at her steadily. "Clara," he said, "I know who you are. I've watched you for 10 days in circumstances that showed me exactly who you are. I'm not asking for a different person. I'm sitting here because this one, the one who reads ledgers at 2 in the morning and talks to marshals like they're the ones who need to keep up, and doesn't cry when rich men humiliate her because she's saving it for when it matters. That's the one I want to stay near." He paused. "If you'll have me." The Silver Moon Saloon was quiet around them. The last few people were putting on their coats, saying their goodnights, moving toward the door, with the unhurried ease of people who have had a good evening. The fire in the stove had burned low. The lamps were amber and warm. Clara Whitmore stood behind the bar that her father had built and looked at the man who had come to Red Hollow looking for one thing and stayed for another, and told her the truth every time she asked for it, and she made the decision with the same clarity she had always brought to decisions that mattered. Not slowly, not with elaborate deliberation, but with the direct recognition of something true. "The room's on the right at the top of the stairs," she said. "The lock sticks. You have to lift the handle while you turn the key." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "It's a bad room." "I'll fix the lock," he said. She picked up her cloth and started wiping down the bar. He stayed on his stool and drank his coffee and watched her work, and neither of them said anything else, and nothing needed to be said. That was December. By March, the first land reversal orders had come through from the commissioner's office, and the Donovan brothers had their grazing parcel back, and Ruth Castle's husband's debt had been officially voided by territorial decree, with a written apology from the commissioner that Ruth framed and put on her wall. Not out of bitterness, but because she said James deserved to see it wherever he was. By April, the eastern portion of the original Whitmore property had been returned to Clara's name in the territorial land record, and she stood in the commissioner's office in Helena with the deed in her hands and read her own name on it, with the particular feeling of holding something that had always been true, being acknowledged as true at last. By May, the Silver Moon was something different. The back room had been converted into a meeting space. Ruth's cooperative met there on Tuesday mornings, and the new Settlers Assistance Society on Thursday afternoons, and the Grazing Rights Council on the first Saturday of every month. The bar was still a bar, and Clara still ran it with the iron competence she had always brought to it. But the room had a different quality now, warmer and more various. The quality of a place that understood itself to be useful in ways that had nothing to do with how much whiskey it sold. Ethan had fixed the lock. He had also fixed 3 other things in the building that Clara had been managing around for so long. She had stopped seeing them as problems, and he had done it without announcing the intention or making a ceremony of the completion. Simply one morning, each thing had been fixed, and the day continued. She had thanked him for the first one, and he had said it was no trouble, and after that, she didn't say anything more about it, because saying things didn't seem necessary, and he seemed to understand that. He worked with the Donovan brothers on alternating weeks, which gave him a reason to be in town the weeks he wasn't out on the spread, and he had become in the way that people who are genuinely useful to communities become integrated into them, someone that Red Hollow had quietly decided it needed. Hector had started calling him to the forge for secondary opinions on complicated orders. Margaret consulted him on territorial law questions with an air of someone who has decided he's adequate and is declining to make more of it. The new settlers who came through with their families and their questions sometimes ended up talking to him for an hour in the back room over coffee and left looking more organized than when they arrived. He did not try to run anything. He did not try to lead anything. He was simply consistently there in the way that useful things are. They're not demanding attention, not requiring recognition, just present and functional, and making the space around him work better than it would have without him. Clara noticed all of it. She did not say much about it. She didn't need to. The evening that Harvey Dalton came back into the Silver Moon, it was a Tuesday in late May, and the back room was full of Ruth's cooperative, and the bar had a reasonable Tuesday evening crowd, and Clara was working. Dalton came in alone. He looked different from the last time she had seen him, which was, she supposed, because the last time she had seen him, he had been on his way out of a room he'd entered as the most powerful presence in it, and now he was coming into a room without that assurance. He was still well-dressed. He was still Harvey Dalton. But something in his bearing had changed the way the bearing of men who are accustomed to operating under a particular order changes when that order shifts. He sat at the bar. He didn't look at anyone else. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Dalton," she said. "Whiskey," he said. She poured it. He sat with it for a long moment without drinking it. "Caldwell and I go back 20 years, he said. Not as a defense. More like a statement of a fact that had a different weight now than it used to." Clara said nothing. "I knew some things," he said. "Not everything. I want to be clear about that." "All right," she said. "But some things." He looked at the whiskey. "I chose not to look closely, because it benefited me not to." Clara looked at him steadily. "I've been in this territory for 30 years, he said. "I built something here. I thought the way things worked was the way things worked, and changing the way things worked was not my concern." He stopped. That was easier to believe before. "Before what?" Clara said. He looked up at her. "Before a woman who runs a saloon looked at a number in a ledger and changed the way things worked anyway," he said. Clara did not look away. "I came to apologize," Dalton said. He said it like the words had weight and he was measuring them as he put them down. What I said to you the night the stranger stood up, what I said before that was wrong. I've said it to you and to others like you for years, because I believed I had the right to, because nobody told me otherwise. He paused. Somebody did now. The bar was quiet around them, in the way that bars go quiet when something is happening that is important to listen to. Clara looked at Harvey Dalton. She thought about the night he had said, "You're just a saloon girl in a room full of laughing men," and she had pressed her hands against the bar and looked at him without flinching, and gone home and started over on her father's ledger for the 100th time, because that was all she could do. She thought about what it cost him to be here. She could see what it cost him in his face, the particular pride of a man who is setting something down that he has carried a long time, and the effort of it. "Apology accepted," she said. He looked up. "I'm not saying it was nothing," she said. "It wasn't nothing, and we both know that. But we're both still in this town, and we're going to be in it for a while, and what we do with that is a choice." She looked at him steadily. "You can start choosing differently." He nodded. He drank his whiskey. He left a fair amount on the bar. After he was gone, Ethan appeared at the end of the counter with his coffee. He had been in the back room for the last hour, she knew, helping with something for the settlers' meeting. He had probably come out in time to observe at least part of the exchange. "Harvey Dalton just apologized to you," he said. "Yes." "And you accepted it?" "Yes." He looked at her. "You're a more generous person than I expected," he said. "I'm a practical person," she said. "This town is small. Generosity is practical." He looked at her with that expression, the one that had been there from the beginning, the one she had finally stopped pretending she didn't see. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "I have something to say." "Then say it." He set down his coffee. He looked at her across the bar her father built in the saloon, that was hers in the town that had laughed at her and was learning to be different, and he said, "I came to Red Hollow for your uncle's sake. I stayed because of what I found when I got here, and what I found—" He stopped, started again with the precision he always brought to things that mattered. "What I found was the most honest, most capable, most stubborn, most extraordinary woman I have ever encountered in my life. And I am not a man who says things I don't mean. And I am not a man who says this kind of thing lightly, so I want you to understand that I mean it exactly as plainly as I'm saying it." The room was very still. Clara Whitmore looked at Ethan Blackwood across the bar. She thought about everything. All of it. Her father, and the ledger, and the changed number, and 3 years, and the high pass in the dark, and Helena, and 12 counts, and the deed in her own name, and the back room full of Ruth's cooperative, and the fixed lock, and a hand on her shoulder that was there and gone in 3 seconds, but never quite left. She thought about what it meant to stop surviving and start living, which were different things, which she was only now learning how to tell apart. "I know you mean it," she said. "And," he said. She looked at him. "And," she said, "I think you should stay." She picked up her cloth and went back to work. He stayed at the bar with his coffee and watched her, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed to be said. The silver moon was warm and full and open for business the way it had always been open for business, and Clara was behind the bar the way she had always been behind the bar, and everything was exactly as it had been, except that everything was different. The saloon girl they had laughed at had never been just a saloon girl, had never been what they decided she was, had never needed their permission to be what she actually was, which was the most capable person in the room, on most days, in most rooms, and the last one standing when everything that tried to take that from her had been brought to justice and set aside. She had stood on her own in the hardest years and built something that mattered out of stubbornness and honesty, and her father's lesson about numbers, and the absolute refusal to accept what everyone around her had agreed she was supposed to accept. And then she had found someone who saw all of that clearly and stood beside it without trying to change a single thing about it. And that had made her not stronger. She had always been strong, but less alone, which was different, which turned out to matter more than she had known how to admit. The Silver Moon Saloon stood on the main street of Red Hollow, Montana, in the spring of 1884. Lit from inside, open to whoever came through the door, belonging entirely and completely and legally to the woman behind the bar. And the woman behind the bar was Clara Whitmore, and she was exactly where she chose to be.